Good morning. Welcome to the Kentucky Department of Education's Kentucky Technical Advisory Committee. I'm Rhonda Sims, Associate Commissioner in the Office of Assessment and Accountability. I'll remind you that Kentucky Revised Statute 158 6455, amended 2021, requiring Kentucky to form its own technical advisory committee. Kentucky has selected 5 members to join this advisory committee. We will meet them shortly. With me today on Teams, I have several leadership members from the Kentucky Department of Education in the Office of Assessment and Accountability, and I'm going to pause here for them to introduce themselves. So I will ask Kevin O'Hare, who's done a lot of the management with Brian, to start the meeting today, and then we'll move to Jennifer Stafford next. Kevin, can you come on camera and introduce yourself, please?
Yes, ma'am. Thanks, Rhonda. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin O'Hare. I'm an academic program manager in the Office of Assessment and Accountability. It's good to be with you all today, and I know we've got a lot of very good topics to discuss. As Brian and the center will kick things off in just a few moments with a lot of great information. So, thanks so much for joining us today, and we look forward to all the great conversation. Thank you.
Jennifer
Good morning.
Stafford?
I'm Jennifer. Yes. Good morning. I'm Jennifer Stafford. I'm the director in the Division of Assessment and Accountability Support. We're on the communications and training side, and I welcome each of you here today. I appreciate so much your attention today, and we look forward to the good discussion and some guidance and recommendations from you. I'll turn it to Helen Jones, the program manager in our division.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all so very much for being with us today. As Jennifer said, I am actually the program manager in Jennifer's division, and I get to work with all of these amazing people. I look forward to hearing from you guys today and listening in on the discussion. So thank you for being here. And with that, is Jenny Larkins?
Yes, hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Larkins. I'm an academic program manager in the Division of Assessment and Accountability Support. And like everyone else, I'm also looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you. I'm not sure. Who's next?
John Wickheiser, are you in the conference room and maybe with other staff?
Yes, I'm John Wickheiser. I'm the data branch manager for the Office of Assessment and Accountability.
We also have Ben Riley, who will be our technical support. And we also have Megan Osborne, who is helping us broadcast this meeting today virtually. Ben, anything for you?
I will just hop on and introduce myself. My camera, let me fix that. There we go. Now you can see me. Good morning. I'm Ben Riley. I'm the systems consultant for the Division of Assessment and Accountability Support, and I will be providing tech support to our wonderful TAC and all of our participants today. If you're in the Teams meeting live, just reach out to me via the chat function, and I will ensure we have as smooth as possible of a meeting. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. You'll meet several of our key partners, including Bill Audie and our staff from Humro today as we go through the work, and obviously center staff that are working with us as well. I do want, before I hand the meeting over to Brian Gong, our facilitator, I do want to just remind everyone there are some particular rules and expectations when we conduct virtual meetings. The meeting must comply with the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. So accordingly, KTAC members must ensure their video is streaming and they can be seen throughout the duration of the meeting. Committee members, please mute your microphone when not speaking. However, all discussions must be broadcast to the public. Therefore, be sure to turn your mic on when you're ready to speak. Every time you speak during the meeting, please unmute your mic, state your name, and take a short pause. That'll give the software time to recognize you. Please silence or turn off other electrical or other devices that might be around you as much as possible. Minutes will be taken and shared with the general public on the KDE website when available. In addition, KRS 1586455 requires that the department submit reports regarding the advice and recommendation of the committee to the Office of Education Accountability by July 1 and December 1 annually. So with that and our reminders, I'll see if we have any questions or any technical issue that KDE resolves. Again, we value so much the expertise our TAC members and the center and our other partners bring to the table every day that they work with us. And we stand ready to try to support those conversations today as needed. Any question before we should begin around the format of the meeting? I took my teacher pause there. Brian, I will hand it to you.
Thank you, Rhonda. Welcome, KTAC members and others. We're looking forward to an informative discussion today of some important topics. Before we start, I'd like to invite the members of the Kentucky Technical Advisory Committee to introduce yourselves briefly. Let's go in this order. Elena, and then Corinne, Pete, Suzanne, and Phoebe. Elena first, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elena Diaz-Balello, and I'm with the University of Colorado Boulder.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Corinne Huggins-Manley. I'm with the University of Florida.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Pete Goldschmidt. I'm faculty at California State University, Northridge.
Thanks, Pete.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Suzanne Lane. I'm Professor Emeritus from the University of Pittsburgh and serving as an independent consultant now.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Good morning. I'm Phoebe Winter. I'm an independent consultant in assessment design, research, and analysis.
Thank you, Phoebe and other members of the TAC. As you saw, we have three major topics that we're going to be discussing today on the agenda. The first is accountability standard setting, and that will be a follow-up to discussion that we had last meeting. And then we'll have a long introduction discussion about Kentucky's assessment design. I think this will be the first comprehensive introduction to the assessment system that the KTAC has had. And as part of that, Bill Audi will be going over not only the design, but the technical documentation and resources that are generated as part of the program. And the third major topic will be coming back to the research plan that HMRO is responsible for. This is a continuation of the discussion that we had a couple of TAC meetings ago, but HMRO has some additional updates. And then we will conclude with some next steps and a summary. Does anyone have any questions or suggestions about the agenda for today? Okay. One of the things that is required, as Rhonda mentioned, is that there are minutes that are taken and posted publicly to the KDE website. The minutes for last meeting, which focused on the accountability standard setting, those were sent to the TAC right after the meeting last time. I think people had a chance to see it, and they were posted again just recently to the shared folder. Do any of the TAC members have any comments or suggested modifications or corrections to the minutes? If not, could I invite a motion to approve in a second?
Suzanne Lane, I motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Phoebe Winter, I second.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor to approve the minutes, could you say aye or raise your hand?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We'll proceed with the first major topic, accountability standard setting. And For that, we have we're doing double duty today. I'm here with my colleagues. I'll ask Chris Domaleski and Laura Pensino to introduce themselves before we start with the presentation and discussion. Chris?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Domaleski with the Center for Assessment. Very pleased to join you today to contribute to the discussions.
And good morning. It's nice to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Laura Pensino. I'm an associate at the Center for Assessment. Happy to be here today.
Thank you. Laura, if you'll go ahead and advance the slides as we go. The statute, the law that was passed by Kentucky's General Assembly that established Kentucky's accountability system changed a number of elements. And one of the things that was also included in the law was that the certain aspects of the accountability system would need to be reviewed and approved not only by the Kentucky Department of Education, the Commissioner of Education, but also by what's established in statute as Local Superintendents Advisory Council. This is a group of district superintendents. And so what we're going to start with is the presentation that was given to them just recently, and that will create most of the framework for the update that we're presenting today and then issues for discussion. Laura, if we could go ahead, please. So there was an agenda for that meeting, which took place at the very end of April. Next slide. And then there's some background. The law was established in 2020, and it named what the measures were, and so there were some measures that were included in Kentucky's accountability system prior to this, which were discontinued, and then it included some measures which were new. The most noticeable measure was that it replaced growth with change as a cross-cohort measure, which was defined as status or the most recent year's performance compared to the previous year's performance and the difference of that. So change was defined as a simple arithmetic subtraction of 1 year's status from the other for each indicator. Those were staggered in time. So status was incorporated, reported, and performance standards were set for them last year in 2022. You may recall the discussion about that. The reason that we're having this discussion now is that change is going to be implemented for the first time using 2023 data, and so there will be a standard setting for accountability performance later this summer and fall. And so those are, it's the more complex standard setting involving change that we'll be asking KTAC for their input on. Thanks, Laura. Next slide. And so the approach for standard setting is similar to what you are familiar with for assessment performance level standard setting. These are going to be accountability performance levels, and there are actually a number of them. But we'll go over the procedures for that we're asking for your input on today. Next slide. And here we are in between May and June. In June, we'll have a workshop where the standard setting committee will review the performance level descriptors for indicators and for overall school performance. Then the cut scores will be set in September, and then those will be reviewed and approved, go through the review and approval process by KDE and LSAC sometime after September, and then those will be, when approved, will be incorporated into reporting. in the fall. Next slide, please. As a reminder, if we could go to the next slide, there are some key policy questions that we were asking the Kentucky Department of Education and the local Superintendent's Advisory Council for input on. There were these three specific questions. One was the status performance level cut scores were set in 2022 last year, and should the standard setting committee this year be encouraged to treat those as set, or should they be open? The committee was told that they would get a chance to revisit those, and so one of the questions was policy guidance. How open should the standard setting committee view those from the policy guidance perspective? The second was the statute established category names, but didn't establish the definition, and maintained is a category for change. One of the important policy decisions would be to whether maintained means did not decline at all, or whether there would be some margin of confidence around that performance. So it would be at least as high as the previous year, which would mean that if you did the change score, it would have to be 0 or greater, or could it be plus or minus 0 plus or minus something? And then the third question that we were asking for policy guidance to take to the standard setting committee was the change scores might be set so they're same regardless of the school's status score, or they might be set considering what the school's status score is, what we call conditional upon status. And so there wasn't a decision about that because everyone agreed that they needed to see the 22-23 data, but just in principle, what would the policy guidance be? So those were three questions that we asked KD and LSAC for, and we'll show you what the guidance was, but we'd also ask you like some technical input about those questions, as well as some additional questions about how to combine the scores that we're wrestling with now. We'll do a quick review just so we're level setting about what the standard setting is. So the standard setting needs to comply with legal requirements, such as a statute saying there are 5 levels. We can't change the levels, we can't change the labels. The policy priorities, some of those we'll talk about in just a minute, but also the 3 that we raised. The KTAC gave input about the representativeness of the panel, and if you would like, KDE, who has been recruiting, could talk about how they've been responsive to the suggestions that you had about making sure that the panel is as representative as possible, and that's documented well. We're going to follow a similar structured judgmental process grounded in clear definitions of performance data and feedback. We'll go over the procedures with you to show you how that's being done. And then, as happened in the past, there'll be a report. You received the report for standard setting from last year, and those are made, both the standard setting meeting is open to the public, and the documentation is open. So Kentucky's following a very open process for and transparent for doing their standard setting for accountability. Any comments or questions about this so far? Suzanne, please.
Hi, Brian. I would like to hear a little more about the representativeness of the standard setting panels and the extent to which they serve different groups of students, the teachers and administrators across the panel. Thank you.
All right, thank you. As I recall, the KTAC had 3 specific questions last time. One was that there was a suggestion that the documentation include not only role, such as superintendent, teacher, or curriculum leader, or so on, but also something about the type of school or community from which they came. I think a second question was how would there be ensuring that everyone's voice was heard and that one group didn't dominate the other. We can talk about that in terms of the procedures as well when we get to that. And I think the third one was had to do with to make sure that populations that were not necessarily major school populations, so EL, people serving EL, special ed, and parents and community members were also represented. So, Rhonda, is there someone who might be able to address Suzanne's question in the way I expanded it?
Sure, absolutely, Brian. We are obviously the meeting is coming up, so we're confirming our last member, but I'll tell you a little bit about the change between the 2 periods of time between last year and this year. The first comment I'd like to make is we saw the need to add a couple of people to the upcoming year. We have a specialist with English language learners that has been added. That serves, he works out of one of our educational cooperatives. We also have a district, what's called a director of special education that has been added. We have brought forward many of the members from last year. We've also done recent look to make sure we have a variety of we know we have a variety in terms of small districts, large districts, rural. We don't really have a lot of urban centers in Kentucky. Jefferson County is really our only true urban area, but we have both size represented. We've also had our data staff to look at sort of the performance of those districts. So we have a good balance across both lower performing and medium and high performing districts. We've added a student member. We had that last year. We've continued that. Our student member from last year has graduated and is moving on to college. And so we have a new member who accepted yesterday out of our commissioner's student advisory committee. And he is a rising senior from an Eastern Kentucky high school. Very excited to be part of the process. So I think we have a roughly 30 people, a little less. I think we're at maybe 29 or 30 right now. We don't anticipate adding more. So I think we've captured a good sample with 30 people. We do have principals, we have teachers, we have administrators that are more district assessment coordinators, instructional supervisors. We also have some of our what we call our K groups that represent school administrators, represent KEA, the Kentucky Education Association. We have folks from those partner organizations as well. So I think we're at a good place with that, but we did hear those good comments from you in the past. And so we have added a couple of key people that I think will be really reflective of some expertise that we had that we didn't have as much of last year. We also have, Jennifer reminded us in chat, we also have 2 members of our Kentucky Board of Education. Our current legislation does not have our board in any authority position over this process or accepting the outcome, but we do have 2 Kentucky board members. One has previously been a teacher, administrator, and superintendent, and the other has been a teacher. And so we're very pleased to have their leadership as well as part of the process. Jenny Larkins has been helping confirm those members. Jenny, did I leave out anyone or Jennifer that you would add?
Did you mention the parent representatives? I'm not
Right.
sure.
Right. We do have parent representatives. We have someone connected to PTA. We have someone who's been working with our Kentucky United We Learn Council work that you've seen recently, that I think we shared at least briefly on one of our prior meetings, that is thinking more forward of what assessment might be in the future. And then we also have someone who serves as a parent advocate. She actually was on the committee last year as a high school teacher and is now a parent engagement leader for Fayette County Schools, which is the Lexington, Kentucky area. So I think that are the main parent. Jenny, did I leave anyone out on the parents? I'm doing all this from memory, and as I'm sure you can relate to, at a certain point in your time, your memory is not quite as crisp as it was when you were 20.
That was great, Rhonda.
Any particular questions that conversation might have brought for you?
This is Suzanne Lane again. Rhonda, thank you so much. And I would just encourage any documentation with this standard setting to provide a description of the panel members and, who they serve, and any communications also to be providing some kind of general description of the panel members. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion. And we can work with the center on producing maybe more detail about each member and their background that they bring to the table. I think I see a hand as well, Brian. I'll give it back to you to facilitate that.
Thank you. This is Corinne from University of Florida. Just following up, because Brian, you had mentioned that one of the things that had come up in the past, and it's in some notes that you uploaded for today, was some procedural things too that might help to make sure that everybody has a voice. I believe last time there were some comments that superintendents were maybe dominating. Is there any plan to change anything this year for this round?
Yes. So those are primarily procedural things. We'll talk about that when we get to the procedure part of the standard setting. Other questions or comments about things so far? Thank you for those really good suggestions. I think standard setting is rests much on its procedure and on the representativeness. So I really appreciate the suggestions on how to both strengthen the selection, but especially the documentation that of the representativeness.
Brian, one thing we may want to add, we also, because the committees are working in 3 smaller groups, we've tried to be very strategic. We don't have this process completed for our upcoming meeting, but in making sure there's a good balance at each table, that you're not having any particular dominating conversation at a particular table, but that you've spread people who come from similar kinds of backgrounds across those 3 smaller groups.
Thank you. Laura, maybe we can go on to the next slide. Standard setting is a balancing act in many ways. So 3 things that we're trying to do is to make sure it's appropriately simple. So it needs to be sensitive enough to reflect real differences, but not so complex that either the standard setters have a difficult time making the judgments that they're asked to make, or that the users and the public consumers of the information have a difficult time understanding either the system or how recommendations were arrived at. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we come to the discussion that we'll have later on about some of the design decisions that we'd like advice on. The other is that in accountability standard setting, the target is more couched in policy and impact than assessment standard setting traditionally. So assessment standard setting has a description on student performance, The school performance will have both, you'll see this, will have both a criterion-based aspect from the measures themselves, but also have some normative information. And it's very, we found that we need to include information about the school performance from the beginning for the, as part of the definitions, but also part of the considerations. We haven't figured out how to show impact data on later rounds. So these policy values are very important, and we're trying to get those clear from the beginning so that the standard setting can be set up to reflect those values and make it so that people can discuss them in a way that is explicit and overt where they need to. The next slide. The policy guidance comes from a number of different bodies. I mentioned the General Assembly, and you can see that they've specified certain things. The Kentucky Board of Education has established weights for and how status and change are going to be combined to create indicator performances. Those are for the state report card. And then you saw that these some of the other policy questions that we were asking KDE and LSAC for. Next slide. And just to review the particular guidance that the Kentucky Board of Education established, if we could go to the next slide, they've established weights for the indicators. Those of you who are familiar with the ESSA requirements, you can see that these are Kentucky's ESSA indicators. The first one is proficiency in reading and math. The other is the other academic indicator in Kentucky that includes science, social studies, and writing. In Kentucky, writing is the it's not ELA, but reading is the focus. Then English learner progress. The quality of school climate and safety is one of the school quality student success measures. Post-secondary readiness and graduation rate. And those latter two are only at high school. You can see the different weights by grade level, grade span. Next slide. The board also set the policy weights for how status and change would be combined in order to produce indicator performance ratings. Indicator performance ratings are colors ranging from red on the low side to blue on the highest, red, orange, yellow, green, blue. And there are 5 change levels, 5 status levels, and the 5x5 table, the board has set what the various combinations of change and status would be. Now, they haven't set the cut scores, and they haven't set the definition of what change declined is, for example. That will be up to the standard setting committee, but they set this overall policy framework for what the, for example, what if you were very high status, what would the lowest possible indicator performance rating be? You can see that here it's yellow if the school declined significantly on its change part. Next slide. Oh, Phoebe, before we go on, Phoebe, please.
Yes, this is Phoebe Winter. It looks like one of the questions was whether change should be set conditional on status, and the guidance here seems to have answered that question, at least in part. Is that the case, or am I misinterpreting this?
The specific question for the standard says they're going to set cut scores, so they're going to say what performance distinguishes, for example, between change declined significantly and change declined. And they could set a single cut score for every status level so that that line goes straight down to the same score. But they could also set it conditional. So for schools that are very high status, that cut scores one thing. For schools that are high status, that cut scores a different thing. That's what we meant by conditional upon status.
I see. Yeah, this is the performance rating that's conditional. Thank you.
Yeah, so the cut score, so it would always be yellow. The very high status with decline significantly, that upper left cell would always be yellow. But what the change score is could be different between very high status and high status, for example. Phoebe, is that you can see why that's an important question in terms of policy guidance. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Pete? Yeah, Pete, please.
Yeah, quick question. So this table, I assume, represents schools, and to that extent, then has it been decided whether this is supposed to reflect the average of the students, or is this the portion in each of the categories, or is that part of the process to decide?
Let's see if I understand the question. So every school gets an indicator performance rating. So the school will get for an indicator. So let's say it's the reading and math proficiency indicator. The school will have a score on status. The school will have a score on change. And then based on those two, the school would get a indicator performance rating of one of these colors.
Right, but the change, for example, represents what about the students in that school?
So the change would be the difference between the status in the most recent year and the status in the previous year.
And is that the average of the individual changes, or is that the average change between the 2 years, or is that the percent of students that are in a particular change category, or some other version?
Right. Oh yeah, good question. So the intention is to generate a school level index score for status. So reading and math, you may remember that Kentucky has four student proficiency levels: novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished, and it generates a school weighted average based on assigning points to those levels and then generating a weighted average for the students. So if a student is a novice, it's 0 points. If a student is apprentice, 50 points. Proficient is 100 points. Distinguished is 125. So the school gets a weighted average for status, and the index goes from 0 to 125. If all the students were distinguished, then the school would be have an index of 125. If all the students were proficient on average, the school would have an index score of 100. If they were all apprentice, the school would have an index score of 50. So the school gets that as its status score 1 year. That's generated again for the previous year, and then this changes the difference between the two.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. And I don't know if this is a discussion for now or for later, so I'll just wait. I assume we're going to go into more detail about change anyway. So,
yes,
yeah, okay, I'll wait till then.
Right. So what I just described was our interpretation of what the statute said. The statute said essentially status will be calculated every year. Change will be calculated every year starting in 23 as the difference between successive status scores. So and it's a true cross cohort measure. So there's no tracking of student of change by student. Pete, I don't know if you had a follow-up question, or we'll get into. We can talk about change now, or if if you want to wait, we can.
No, I'll wait. Thanks.
Okay. Corinne?
Yes, I think this is the right time, but on the prior slide with the accountability weights, I think you were saying that those categories were coming from policy. I was wondering why, and it might just be policy that there's nothing for students with disabilities on here. It's only English language learner when thinking about a group. Yeah.
Yeah, great question. Those, Laura, if we could stay on the previous slide, those categories are Kentucky's categories, but they're also the federal category. So when ESSA was described, then English learners were called out specifically in ESSA, and students with disabilities are included in accountability, but in a different way. And so those categories are Kentucky's interpretation of the ESSA requirements. The ESSA also requires that every school have its results disaggregated by student group, and I'll need maybe Jennifer to remind me if I have the student groups correct. But so students with disabilities, English learners, economically disadvantaged, and then the race, ethnicity categories, African American, white, Hispanic, non-white, Asian Pacific Islander, and Kentucky does an other or combined. And those every school has its results. Got two or more races. Every school has its results disaggregated by that, and then a judgment, an accountability judgment is made for each of those student groups. So they're not called out differently in terms of performance categories, but their overall performance is disaggregated, and then an accountability judgment is made for each of those groups. And that's the current federal law. Laura?
I'm just going to policy geek out for a little moment here and just add one other layer of information, which is, in addition to what Brian was saying, it's important to note that just from a structural perspective, the prior reauthorization NCLB of ESEA situated accountability for English learners within Title III. And there was a separate accountability system for English learners in which their outcomes as measured by the English language proficiency assessment were evaluated. And so accountability is situated over there separately, and oftentimes those reports were not very public. So when ESEA was reauthorized as ESSA, that accountability system for English learners was brought into Title I. And so that was a pretty big deal. But importantly, it's situated around a measure of English language proficiency for English learners. When we look at our other academic assessments, that includes outcomes for students with disabilities. And as in addition to the fact, as Brian already pointed out, that we're disaggregating results for students. The one other policy thing I'll mention is that IDEA, Accountability for within Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that also looks specifically at outcomes just for students with disabilities, as you likely know. So I just wanted to kind of explain a little bit how this is sort of situated around having a measure of progress towards English proficiency for these students and moving that accountability from a different title in the law into Title I, just to give a little context there. I hope that's helpful.
And those of you who are familiar with ESSA requirements might recognize that Kentucky has created the board has approved weights that meet the ESSA requirements, that certain combinations of things be more than 50%. So in particular, reading and math at high school, for example, reading and math graduation rate need to be above 50%. So there are a number of constraints on what the weights could be. Laura, why don't we go ahead and we have these policy questions that we asked Katie and LSAC, and Laura, I think, is going to walk us through what the response was to those, but then also invite your comments.
Yes, thanks, Brian, for setting things up so nicely. I want to just offer a little bit of context around the LSAC conversation. So Brian sort of situated our interaction and KDE's interaction with the Local Superintendent's Advisory Council relative to that requirement in the law. Just so you know, since we last met with you, we've had 2 convenings with LSAC. We first met with them in March. And that was an opportunity to sort of set the stage around the standard setting, to share some of the procedural thinking, but really to introduce the questions that we had and to invite their initial reactions. And in the course of that conversation, the group said, thank you, these are great questions. We'd like to reach out to the other superintendents that we interact with. This is a representative body, and they felt it was important to seek input from their peers. And so they conducted a survey between the March meeting and then when we next convened with them, which was just a couple weeks ago at the end of May. And between those meetings, they then also provided to us the feedback that they received in the course of that in response to the survey. So when we met with them a couple of weeks ago, we wanted to lift up these questions as you see here and make sure we understood and had a correct, we were appropriately representing the responses from them and their peers, and invite any other conversation, discussion, or feedback that they might have. So I just wanted you to know sort of what the approach was and what you'll see in the following slides. And as Brian said, we will share with you what we heard from LSAC, but also invite your reactions and observations to their guidance as well, of course. So the first question, as we see, is firmly situated around status, and really we're asking LSAC, to what extent should we, as facilitators, sort of structure the process and invite the panel, the standard setting panel, to consider change, I shouldn't use the word change here, to revisit the status cuts that were established last year, or to try to sort of consider those, to prioritize comparability to what the cuts were that were set last year. And so really what we're talking about here is the cut scores that determine those status categories for each of the indicators, and whether in the process, and the panel will follow a process, but in that process, to the extent to which we would say, and you should know that there's been guidance that would prioritize or keeping these the same, considering tweaks, or maybe broader changes in the course of these, in the course of the panel's process. And what we heard from LSAC was, the sort of short answer is, go ahead and consider tweaks, but we think that it's important to look at the data, to inform their judgments by the data, but LSAC would appreciate sort of minor adjustments to the extent that that's appropriate. The group validated the process that took place last year, and they appreciate the fact that there'll be new data available this year, but felt that that was a good process. And to the extent that that is true, they felt that hopefully only minor adjustments would be necessary. So that's what we heard on the conversation of status. And yes, Phoebe.
Yes, this is Phoebe Winter. When I was looking at the performance level descriptors for this one, the reference is above the state score in 2022. Would that stay the same, or does that change from year to year? Or would it always be in reference to the 2022 state score right now? I mean, if nothing was revised.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the PLDs that the panel will establish for this coming year do reference 2022, and that's the starting point. We're referring to that, and actually, I think you all had this recommendation to refer to the baseline year, and and so the versions of the PLDs that we'll be working from kind of reference the baseline year at the beginning of the descriptors and indicate that for status that is 2022. The idea is that the baseline stays the same and we're looking at performance relative to that. So that's how the PLDs aren't intended to change every single year. Any follow-up to that, Phoebe?
No, thank you.
Okay.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Okay, good. I'm glad you're glad. I'm glad too. I think Katie is probably glad not to have to update those, as would the field be. Suzanne?
Laura, I think this is, my question has to do with what you were discussing previously. In the report, when there's a reference with regard to Table 1, and it indicates that there's modifications were proposed and adopted. Mm-hmm. And could you just provide me with some summary of what factors were considered for those particular modifications?
So this is in reference, just to give a little context for those who haven't looked at the, Suzanne is referencing the, I believe, final standard setting report from 2022. As a reminder, the panelists were examining status outcomes and overall outcomes. So the cuts they were setting were determining indicator ratings that were based just on status, as well as overall performance ratings that were based on the combination of status outcomes or indicator outcomes, which were the same because we just had status last year. So panelists examined those indicator outcomes for status first across the indicators, and then they were shown a profile of performance for schools that helped them to exercise their judgment in setting cuts at the overall school rating level. So at the indicator level, there were discussions about the distribution of performance, and that really informed the panelists' judgment and recommendations in regard to the cuts that they recommended. And particularly in a couple of areas, English language progress was one area where the panel said they felt that there should be some changes made from between sort of rating rounds. And so they had an opportunity to vote. And if more than 2/3 of the group agreed with that, then we made changes. And the full group, we had that, I shouldn't say the full group, but at least we had a supermajority that approved any adjustments. And so that was sort of the process. The conversation was typically based around what are appropriate expectations alongside what are the kind of distributions of performance that the panel felt were appropriate across the different grade spans. And I'll pause. You may have a follow-up, Suzanne, but I just want to see if Brian or Chris had any further recollections to offer.
Yeah, I'll just, thanks, Laura, that was an excellent explanation. I'll just offer a thought procedurally about how the design is intended to work. So you folks that had a chance to review the report may have seen where the panelists are going through 2 rounds of ratings, which is a time-consuming process. They're doing an individual rating, they're discussing, they're doing another round of rating. And the idea behind this is once they've collectively looked at this twice and people are starting to see the areas of agreement and disagreement, they may coalesce on a change that seems attractive to make as a group. They'd say, we feel like we've dialed in on the rating, except if we just tweaked it in this direction or that direction. And instead of, if everybody sort of agrees on that, rather than say, all right, go back and do yet another round of time-consuming ratings, we take a supermajority affirmation as essentially something that would have produced a median rating that reflects their preferences there. So that's the way the process is designed, and that's what we just call that sort of a modification that's made with essentially group consensus.
Phoebe?
Phoebe Winter, please forgive me if it's defined in the document and I missed it. What is the state score? Is it the state average index score or something else?
Someone from KDE can correct me, but I believe the state score is aggregated. It just treats the state like a big old school. Someone else could correct me if it's something different than that, but that's my understanding. I see a chat. We'll have a quiet correction. That's correct. Okay, great. Pete?
Yeah, I wasn't sure when to ask this question, but it seems like we're getting further into the weeds. So some of the previous slides has given some policy guidance around this whole process and the outcomes. But I guess what I'd be curious in seeing was whether or not there was some sort of overarching Kentucky Department of Education theory of action that was presented to the panelists so that they could put all of these pieces of policy together in an overarching manner so that they can make some sense of what's trying to be accomplished here.
So the panelists are presented the policy guidance, and they will be because there's new guidance that comes into play. Some may consider the guidance as a constraint. Some may think it is something that is less of a constraint in the system, but it certainly provides some direction for the panelists. I don't know that the policy has been established in the context of a theory of action around the work. The policy has come from different settings. Some of it is in statute, some of it comes from the Board of Education. And so I hear what you're saying, that they're framing a discussion around standards and expectations relative to a theory of action for improvement can make a lot of sense. The specific guidance and policy that we're discussing here, I think, is framed more as how it informs the process, because it impacts where the panelists have influence, as well as how we might make sure that their voice is, that they have the appropriate opportunities to influence the components that are appropriate. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. It's the process. But what I'm saying is that part of the process needs to ensure that the panelists understand what the overarching goal is, rather than just having all the pieces that kind of arbitrarily end up in a goal, or may not be the goal that we're trying to accomplish.
That's very wise advice. Thank you. And something that definitely can be incorporated in kind of how the sessions are framed.
Well, if I could just pop in here to make a comment, and yeah, Pete, I really appreciate where you're coming from here. The school performance level descriptors are a very prominent part of this. I mean, so in terms of giving the big picture to the panelists about how we're inviting and eliciting their contributions. Now, recall for this year, in fact, we're having a whole separate workshop just to give them an opportunity to help craft that, which helps them to have a say in what we mean by status, what we mean by change, and what we mean when we put it all together, so that they're supposed to have a vision for what that says about the school from both a relative and criterion reference lens. And so we want that to be a prominent part of the process so they can, quote, see those characteristics as they go about giving their advice about where to set the thresholds.
Thank you, Chris. So,
Laura,
yes, please, Brian.
Pete, do you have a suggestion or an example of how of what a really high level theory of action might be that might reflect the type of policy? We're not asking you to use the ones that we've talked about, but that you're thinking of that because it's clear that we're about the same thing. If you have a bunch of pieces and people are making judgments on the pieces, how they should have an overall idea about how the pieces fit together. But do you have an example of what you're calling a theory of action that would help that might help frame it that way?
I don't know if I have an example of. I feel like I've seen a couple. I don't have an example off the top of my head, but I think that Chris's point is that if in fact some of these elements are more important, then I would assume there'd be a statement that says that we believe that a school that facilitates success for students is a school that demonstrates this, that, and the other, as evidenced by, and then these are the elements that are important. And then that leads to the elements, and that leads to the weight of the elements, and all of that supports what your 3-sentence summary is of a school. So I know I've seen it, but I can't think of it off the top of my head.
Well, that's a good thing. We can try to track down something like that. I think that's really helpful to sort of. I think we have that, but creating that at the beginning rather than plunging people into all the parts, and then if we could have it so that they could refer to it, that would be a helpful thing. I think if you remember where you might have seen one, if you could maybe send that to us, that'd be helpful too.
And that's also, I think, a helpful reminder that while there are certain policy constraints that exist, the guidance, the recommendations from LSAC they do reflect values that at least that particular group has, and we can frame their feedback as values that the panelists may want to consider as well. Elena?
Apologies, this is Elena. I just wanted to kind of, I guess, reiterate the point that Pete is making, because I think part of what's happening in my mind, at least, is trying to understand how this piece, or at least this accountability system, is operating in tandem with, or in relationship, or perhaps very separate from I would say, the more innovative accountability system that is currently being derived from another place. And so, I think there are perhaps very clear value statements that are being placed up front to design, as well as to communicate the reason and the rationale as to why they're doing that. And so I think it's really important to ensure that there's clear understanding of why this is separate, and also why this may look very different. And if it doesn't, then I think it's really important for us to understand what are the underlying values of this system, so that, again, there's clear understanding of where it's perhaps it coheres, or where it perhaps departs from what's being specified within the other accountability system. So I think we haven't had a really clear understanding of what's happening in the other sphere. So I think part of it is I'm just trying to get my head around how this really connects with that, or how separate this is from that.
A great question, Elena. Rhonda or Jennifer, you've been heavily involved with the Cool Council and the innovative assessment and accountability work. Do you have a response that could help address Elena's question about how the two systems, what the underlying values are, how the two systems are envisioned to relate to each other?
I'll start, and Jennifer can add in because Jennifer's working a lot in support of the work with the new. I think we're. I think I would start with what I think we see in this current work is very driven by state legislation. So the need for having a color rating using a dashboard that is very driven by state law. I think the value is, excuse me, identifying for support schools that need that additional support, those that are being identified federally for CSI. I also believe that there's an interest because of change to recognize that lower performing schools may be moving in the right direction, even if their status is lower. And I think those were values that were basically developed by our Kentucky state legislation. Uh, Sorry, a little bit of sinus issues today. I do think that as we move to the new work, that is being very much driven by a grassroots conversation, and it's much more focused on personalization experiences for students. And so I think that they are not very directly connected at the moment. I think they may, because one is in such an early phase of development, and the other is what we have in current law to meet both state and federal requirements. So let me pause there and see if Jennifer is back on with us and would like to maybe take that the next step with some of the new conversation.
Thank you, Rhonda. With the Kentucky United, we learned there are 4 overriding values that they have. The first is reciprocity, in the fact that those members of the Cool Council and the standing committees are working in tandem and actually providing guidance and direction on a future accountability system. So as Rhonda mentioned, we have something in place now with our current legislation, but we're working toward that new accountability. The other one is inclusiveness. We want to be very inclusive of populations, especially populations who are underserved and have in the past not had a voice or a seat at the table. Co-creation is another value that the Cool Council has, in that we are working together with the members and the representatives across the Commonwealth to create something new. There are going to be lots of policy recommendations and resources to be provided. And the last of the values is empathy, and showing that we have values and care for all of our students in Kentucky, especially those that have previously been underserved. So those are the underlying values of the Cool Council.
What
So
I've
did,
heard,
yeah.
what I've heard from the comments from KTAC is that there's a recommendation that the standard setters understand the underlying values and perhaps a theory of action, so that it helps them internalize how the parts should fit together as they make the different parts. And then I think what Elena brought up was that to the extent that it's possible to be able to describe how the values and goals of the current accountability system relate those to those of the evolving future accountability system, so people can see what's similar or different. We haven't brought any of the information about the new assessment and accountability work going on in Kentucky to KTAC, but I would assume that KDE would like to get KTAC input when they feel like it's a right time.
Absolutely, Brian. We would want that.
So, Elena, we'll work together on maybe as we get to the end, we might think of agenda topics for future meetings and make sure that we can identify the new assessment and accountability system as one of those.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Brian. I think, one of the things I just also heard is some of the values you can already see would certainly can play a role in the current system that is being developed. So even thinking about what does reciprocity mean and how can that be manifested within the context of how supports are provided and vice versa. So there are a lot of ways in which some of those values can certainly be infused. And that again goes back to Pete's comment about a theory of action and how all of these pieces come together within a larger kind of supportive network around the accountability system itself. So yeah, I think that would be super helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Very good points, everyone. Really appreciate it. So with that, I'm going to proceed to the next question, which is situated more around, the first question was around status. This is more around change, and it's really situated specifically around on defining maintained. And we wanted to hear from LSAC about whether they felt that a definition for maintaining status outcomes across the change calculation should be defined as at least as high as something, or whether it might include performance within a certain margin. And so really what we're referencing here is how we examine this change column here. Does it have to be at least 0? Or can change include perhaps some decline? Can maintaining, include some decline perhaps within that margin? So what we heard from LSAC was a preference for allowing maintained outcomes to be defined as within a certain margin higher or lower than the previous year. It's worth saying that across the board, LSAC and the superintendents, they connected with, wisely recognized the value of examining the 2023 data as we have that, which of course we'll do in the standard setting workshop in September. But from a policy and sort of a principle perspective, the group felt that it would be appropriate to define maintained performance as a margin above or below the prior year's performance. Pete, I know you had mentioned some interest in change. Did you want to raise your question about kind of change outcomes here?
Sure. So I guess the more I listen to this part, it also makes me think, not to go backwards, sorry, but it also makes me worry a little bit about question 1 in terms of status, because if I understood Brian's description correctly, then the points you get based on the levels are the points that are used to identify what changes. So if everybody was in the highest category, then your rating, your index score is 125 in the previous year, and that's then becomes the base for the change score in the current year, if I'm correct. But that means that so, and I don't know the answers, and I think this requires some analyses, and maybe they exist. But then, because you're arbitrarily assigning index scores to levels, then those levels become part and parcel of the change score, right? Because if you give the advanced level 125, which is 25 points more than the next lower level, then that ascribes a certain, in more sense, value, but there's no empirical reason why that should be 25 points. And then moving across categories has the definitions of moving across the categories is now dependent on the levels that you set more so than the actual movement represents. So I think it'd be very difficult to establish either the change or the levels independently, and you have to work with both of those together to understand what it means to be at a level and what it means to move from that level. And then you can start to take apart whether or not you think movement from those levels should be the same, whether you're moving from the lowest level to the next level, or whether you're moving from a middle level to a higher level, or decreasing. So I think I don't think it's as straightforward as simply picking levels and then saying changes in those levels have these certain kinds of meaning, because the definition of those levels dictate what the changes in those levels mean. I don't know if any of that made sense, but I'm just concerned that this is being simplified more than it ought to be.
Pete, let me see if I understand your comments. I'll see if I repeat it back. A desirable characteristic, and we're looking at that, thinking of that 5x5 table, for example, is to be able to, for a school or another user, to be able to say what characteristic gets a school in a cell, or if a school is in a cell, what is that performance based on? And also, if we're going to move from one cell to another, what would it take? And if things are too conditional, it's very difficult to do that. There could be lots of different ways that could happen. Did I understand the concern?
Well, so I think that's, yes, I think that's definitely a concern as well. But I think the other concern is if the change represents changes in status from one year to the next, the question is whether those status levels are spaced in such a way that the change delineations across the horizontal axis actually maintain the meaning you think they do.
Okay, good. So I think this is this is an example of getting at the topic that we're going to raise after the question number 3.
Okay.
But they're all wrapped up together. So I think so. Let me just go backwards. The proposal was not that each status level get a certain number of points. So, and I don't know if that's what I thought that's what you were saying. So, the very high status, for example, doesn't get 125 points, and then the next one, and the high status get 100 points, or so on. I don't know if that's what your understanding was.
No, I thought the points are based on the individual student score, where if
Yeah.
the
Yes,
student is
okay.
That's what you mean. Yeah.
Okay, right. So a school will have some index score on status ranging between 0 and 125. And the standard setters put some cut scores on that puts them into a category. I think your point was that may have been that when the cut scores are applied, like any standard setting exercise, the categories may not be equal interval, for example. You might have a narrower performance one place than the other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then it becomes more complex when we make it a 2-dimensional table, because the same thing could happen in the other dimension. So if it were that 10 points change makes you change a category at one level, is that true at the next level? And that would only be true if the categories were always the same level, a distance apart. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so yeah. So I think this question of how can we combine performance from the 2 different dimensions in a way that is respectful of the policy guidance that's been given, but also is technically sound and understandable for people. So if, like you say, if I get the same number of points, do I get the same amount of change? Do I get the same change in classification? Is one example of that would be an internally consistent thing to have. People would like that. Am I getting at the issue that you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's I mean, the bottom line is kind of this notion of internal consistency, and I guess other elements that we think about is fairness and it's and I'm not saying what and thinking about exchangeability. And I'm not saying what that exchangeability ought to be. It's just thinking about what it is you want and then whether you're achieving it.
Right. Okay. Yeah, those are great. The reason that you said that related back to the question number one about whether the status was the same isn't a question about so the recommendation from LSAC was don't change the status score. If you change the status score, it's recognized there won't be comparability from last year to this year. Your concern that you're bringing up is when people set the status cut scores, they ought to be thinking about the properties that those will impose when they combine them with the change. So you're not talking about year-to-year change the way the LSAC was, is that right?
That and the fact that if you're setting a cut score for status and change doesn't exist, your view of status might be, well, this is very important. I need to have some flexibility in what I believe the status is versus, oh, you have some opportunity for growth, and so maybe I'm going to be more rigorous on my status cut scores.
Okay, yeah. So people ought to consider them together because the system considers them together. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Phoebe?
Yes, this is Phoebe Winter. Will the panelists be shown, given some things they can play with? You know that I'm very concrete, so it always helps. So, for example, showing the numbers from 0 to 125 and where the cut scores are, and then showing how the interaction between status and change might happen depending upon, so almost like a slider you could do. So if you input this, then you see what's going to happen overall. Because I think that would help. It would help me a lot to visualize the real effects of some decisions and see how things might change if there's a very narrow band versus a very wide band for any particular status category. Is that something you're considering?
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Jump in here
Yeah.
and respond to Phoebe's good question. So the answer is yes. They will get. We're trying to thread the needle between giving them all the information that they could want to see and not overwhelming them with so much information that it's hard to see the forest for the trees. So they will certainly get the scale range, and they will look at the distribution in terms of the real either status, performance values, or change in terms of the magnitude of change that we've observed between year 1 and year 2. And they'll get relative information so they can see, this is exceptionally rare or this is more common. So we're going to give both the absolute scale, and we'll give them normative information so they know how exceptional a change of a certain magnitude is. So now recall that combining them is governed by those tables that are fixed. So they'll do the status, they'll do the change, and then this table here, which is based in policy, shows how they come together to give an overall performance level that is, at the indicator level, which is defined by a color. And then this goes a little beyond what you asked, but just to maybe complete the statement. But then there's this final step of setting an overall threshold for the school based on these different patterns of indicator colors. Each of those colors represent the merging of status and change. So there's a lot going on here, but get back to what you asked originally, Phoebe. Yes, we're going to show them the actual scale, values, and relative information about that.
And thank you, Chris. And my suggestion is trying to, and maybe this is in there, is trying to also illustrate the interaction between the two. I've done years ago, I did a slider thing, very ugly because it was before technology was there, that showed the interaction among 5 different elements and then what the outcome would look like. But I think, seeing that where the bands would be and what narrows when you do what might be helpful. But then again, I might be, I like to get a little complicated. So thank you.
No, it's noted and appreciated, Phoebe. I think you're right. You may have been listening in on some of our planning conversations where we've imagined some of the same things.
Pete?
Not to make things difficult, but since you guys are doing it anyway, and I think Phoebe's point is really good. And for this table, I think I can envision 2 versions of it. One where the rows in the column heights and widths are based on the distribution of people in the cells, and a separate one that's based on the scale itself. So so that you can compare visually the difference between the kind of the operational settings of it and then the outcome itself.
Mm-hmm. That sounds fun. Thank you for volunteering to do that for us, Pete. We really appreciate it. We're going to need it about by the beginning of September, if you don't mind.
Sure, you'll have it tomorrow.
No, that's a great idea.
That's the tax job, is to give you just tasks.
Chris, did you have a follow-up?
I was just expressing my appreciation. I think it's a really clever idea.
Yeah, I agree. I like that. Thank you. Oh, such good recommendations and discussion. Thank you, everybody. I am going to take us back to our third question, which we're kind of already stepping into, really. And it's actually worth starting by looking at this earlier slide that we're already on, just with a couple points. So as you said, Pete, there's sort of this question of the interaction of status and change. And that's the last question that we posed to LSAC. We asked them to sort of consider the extent to which outcomes for change should be dependent on starting status, whether we kind of want a conditionality there. So, when we present this to the panel, are we inviting them to consider different change cuts based on that on their status? And really, this is kind of saying, are the numbers the same as I think Brian said earlier down the column or not? And what we heard from LSAC was there might be, again, look at the data, please, but there might be instances where there would be differences. Again, we go back to some of our own priorities in setting up the system that we allow for appropriate nuance, but also try to keep it as simple as possible. So that's something that we're tending to as we think about the process. But as we look at this table, just a reminder that this applies the same way to every single indicator across all grade spans. And so it's really important that the panelists understand their role in defining each of the categories for change and status, because the interplay is beyond the panel. But the definitions and those ranges of scores that fall in each of those categories is where the panel exercises its influence in the system. And that can differ by grade span and indicator. So again, we're kind of talking about how we define those minimum scores. And as I said, we suggested to LSAC some of the considerations, as we will have data before the September workshop, some of what we'll examine in the data to inform the conversation, looking at ceiling effects and floor effects, of course, looking at some of the ranges of change scores in particular, for different status levels, by grade ranges, by indicators. As you can imagine, when we're talking about something like graduation rate, the change scores look very different than they might for outcomes, for example, English language proficiency or either of the other academic assessment indicators. So LSAC said their primary concern is about the impact on overall ratings. And there's a little bit of confusion about, and it's worth reiterating an important point that Chris made earlier, which is that the indicator rating decision table has been set, as we were just examining. When we look at overall ratings, that the panel will have a discrete process there where they're examining the profile of outcomes for across indicators, but they also will be looking at combined scores. So the thresholds that the panelists will set for overall performance ratings will be based on score combinations, not just their indicator ratings. And I think there was some concern that maybe there's like another table that this table is actually determining overall performance ratings, and it's not. It's determining the indicator ratings. It's a weighted combination of the indicator scores that produce the overall score, and that's what panelists will be, it's upon those scores that panelists will be setting cuts. So we talked about that with LSAC and hopefully made that clear. But again, we continue to hear from them that they're going to want to make sure we're really allow for the process to have some coherence checks along the way. We'll talk about the process in just a second. And we are trying to make space for that. So that's one of the benefits of continuing to have a little more time with the panelists, both in June and in September. Are there any questions about this, or Chris or Brian, anything I missed that you want to add or clarify? Okay, so we did, in the course of the conversation with LSAC, we did ask them to kind of approve the process. We affirmed that we were all in the same place around the feedback that they had been provided. So we feel confident that we understood their recommendations. We then wanted to share with them and sort of pivot a little bit to just talk about what the process is going to be. Brian shared that kind of timeline. I want to just go a step more detailed with you, just to kind of walk through what we're planning over the course of the two events. So overall, we're thrilled to be able to have two separate events, one to focus on those performance level descriptors for almost 2 days, and a separate process for almost 3 days to focus on the standard setting. As a reminder, last year we had almost 2 days, or I'm going to say less than 2 days, because it very much felt like that, for the whole process last year. So we're really pleased to be where we are. So as we, in just, I was going to say a couple weeks, next week, we'll be convening with the panel to review and approve, revise as appropriate performance level descriptors. Those PLDs describe status, the different status ratings. They describe the change ratings. They do clarify this table, so everyone knows sort of how we describe indicator ratings. It's really a description of this table. And of course, overall school performance ratings as well. And so they'll really be spending time kind of thinking about what it means to describe performance. And as Brian mentioned earlier, the descriptions provide they are both sort of descriptive, sort of criterion reference, as well as normative and in nature. And we're really trying to empower the panel to apply language consistently across the PLDs so that they can be confident they understand sort of what certain language means when we describe performance relative to the state score, for example, or when we describe performance on average and we're looking at status, or when we're looking at change relative to other schools. So we're really trying to structure a process where they are able to do that. As with the standard setting, where they're setting cut scores with the PLDs, there will be time for individual review, table discussions, and large group discussions across multiple rounds, because we're all humans and folks need time to think and process and learn, and their judgment may change over the course of those conversations. So we'll focus on status, then change. We're kind of building up throughout the course of the process. So that's June. Our goal is actually to incorporate the recommendations between the first and second days of the meetings, so that day 2, the panelists will be able to review updated, revised PLDs based on their feedback, and hopefully be in a really confident place going into September. At that September workshop, it is worth noting that we will revisit the PLDs, because we will have data that includes 2023 data at that point, and that's really critical, especially considering change. And so there will be time in the workshop to revisit and finalize the PLDs based on their review of the data, which we will share in the course of the meeting. And then the panelists will establish those cut scores using the 2022 thresholds as a starting point. So that is based on the feedback from LSAC and KDE regarding our first question. And then we'll establish those change cut scores. And again, they'll have that data to look at, so they'll have to sort of understand what we see, at least for this first year of change. And then we'll do a check across status and change, making sure that we've got appropriate amount of coherence there, and things are looking as folks are comfortable with. We'll transition at that point to examine school performance profiles. And again, all of this is happening with some individual review time, table discussion, and large group discussion. Over the course of those cycles, panelists will input into forms online. They'll input their recommended cuts. We'll kind of level set across those at the different checkpoints in the process, and review those proposed cut scores for coherence, both at the overall level and across indicators and grade spans. And so that's the fun of the facilitation in those processes, is kind of bringing everything together and making sure everyone has a voice as we review. After September, we take the recommendations from the panel and share those again with the Commissioner of Education and with LSAC, so they have opportunity to review and approve the cut scores that came out of this process, and those will be applied to the reports that will come out in the fall. So this is a slightly more granular description of the approach that we're planning. It obviously doesn't go into every detail, but hopefully you get a sense of how we're trying to address the cycles and the steps that should be incorporated in the process. Are there any questions or comments about this? Pete?
Sorry to keep raising all these wacky questions.
That's why we're here. You're
guess.
with your people, Pete. It's okay.
That's true. I'm so often not with them, and they just roll their eyes. So I don't know if this is part of your super in the weeds, but I think and kind of this piggybacks on what Phoebe had said earlier in being concrete. And I think what would be really useful is if, and maybe you do this, is if you took a school with 10 students and did and demonstrated the calculations so that the panelists can see the flow of all of the different pieces, not get lost in the arithmetic, because it's very small. You can make the numbers very easy. But I think that's a very concrete way of understanding how, when you make a decision, you can see how that flows through, and it's not just you're in the middle level in this row and the middle level in this column, and now you're orange or whatever it might be, but actually seeing, oh, okay, we have 4 kids at 50 and 3 kids at 100, we average those out and then we do the subtraction or whatever the actual steps are. I think a simple example like that would be really useful for people to have in their back pocket.
That's really helpful. Another thing we were thinking about, and we don't have it in these slides, but Katie's been doing a really excellent job kind of building out the reports for the system. And I think seeing how the information will be reported also helps sort of build an understanding of some of the relationship and when you can kind of envision how the information is going to be presented by, indicator, status change overall, that helps as well. So I appreciate your suggestion, Pete, to provide some concrete examples. So we really appreciate your feedback here. Thank you all so much for your great questions. Oh, I see Elena. I'm not trying to skip you. Go ahead, Elena. Sorry. Your window is smaller on my screen for some reason. So a little hand. There you are.
All right.
Okay.
Apologize. This is Elena. I also was wondering, it might also be helpful to get a sense of the characteristics of the different elements within each of those indicators, because it's really hard to get a sense of how much change actually occurs, for example, for some of the indicators that are in there. And it's really hard for me to understand, like, to what extent are we seeing some of those post-secondary readiness indicators really shift, and what does that mean, and what are the implications then for thinking about how that impacts all the other aspects of the system? I'm sure this is something, I know for a fact that this is something that all of you folks at the center have thought about deeply, but it's something that's in the back of my mind in terms of how do I make sense of how these pieces come together, in terms of understanding what kind of transitions or shifts actually do occur as a function of the type of indicators that are in there and that have been selected, and understanding those characteristics.
Yes, you tee up our next question really well. Thinking about the relationship across change and status and how much change we actually see. We have been examining some of the data to the extent we can, but obviously we're missing some years there, so it makes calculating change complicated. So we're really excited to get the 2023 data as we look at that. And we are, as Chris said earlier, absolutely planning on, in the course of the standard setting events, making sure that folks have an appropriate, as much data is gonna help them exercise their judgment appropriately. And that will absolutely have to include an examination of what kind of change we see, and how different amounts of change. That's why we think that normative piece is going to be really helpful when we talk about change scores. And we'll make sure that folks have access to that information in the standard setting in September. And so, yeah, Chris, I'm going to pass it off to you to kind of pick up where we're leaving off here, as it leads well into something else we've been thinking about and we'd really like your input on. So again, thank you all for your feedback about the process and LSAC's guidance. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Laura. And as you noted, Elena's question does take us to our last question very nicely. It's a good transition. We wanted to, one of the really more challenging issues with this whole process is determining how we're going to scale change and how we're going to use that to combine the indicators in a way that honors the weight. So we don't have slides or data to show you here. We just really wanted to sketch out the issue and share with you some of our thinking about that in a general sense, and invite the TAC to share any ideas or insights you have that can help us arrive at a solution that you think is most promising given the constraints that we're negotiating here. So when it comes to, so as Elena noted, these change values have, just your instincts are right, have very different properties across indicators. And those properties are themselves very different from status. And so coming up with a way to reflect that in a way that's clear to stakeholders and can be interpreted well and can be combined to honor the weights is really the problem we're trying to solve. So let me just share with you a little bit of some of the ideas that we've considered as we've been negotiating this challenge, and maybe you'll have thoughts about one or other of these methods, or maybe there'll be other things that we haven't thought of that you can share with us. So we can certainly operate sort of one solution path is to operate in raw scores. Now I'll go ahead and say we don't think this is promising, but let me just say this for the sake of completeness. An advantage of that would be it would be easy to understand, it would be intuitive, but it would produce very different scale ranges compared to status, including negative numbers. So, for example, graduation rate change scale is something like -5 to +3. So that's a very constrained range of values and has properties that aren't easy to work with for accountability system. So that's one class of solutions. Another is that there's a variety of ways to do a linear transformation with some desired minimum standard deviation. So we can easily produce scale ranges that fit desired characteristics. You know, for example, we can say, let's produce change so it has a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10, or pick some other scale characteristics that you think might be attractive for reasons that could be articulated. And we could also standardize those ranges so that there's consistent interpretation. So 50 is always the mean, or the highest scale value is always the value at the 95th percentile, something like that is another class of scaling solutions we could look at. But the negative side of that, it would be new to stakeholders, it's complicated, and we know in our interaction with the department that we really need to prioritize solutions that are straightforward and very clear. Another class of solutions would be to assign index values to the categories, those 5 different very low to very high categories. That would be probably the simplest approach. We can choose values that reflect desired scale characteristics if we do that. We can guard against unintended negative consequences. For example, if we don't want change declines to have a disproportionate negative impact for high status schools, and you can choose scale values that mute that impact. So there's some pliability with that class of solutions. But, and I think we talked about this at the last TAC meeting, those kinds of solutions are very coarse. And if you try to resolve that coarseness by creating more categories or conditioning, then you get back to the problem of complexity. And you might just be taking a long way around to a very complex solution. So I'm going to stop there. And again, all that was just in service to share some of the ideas that here at the center and with the department we've been discussing as sort of broad ways to think about addressing this challenge. And I'd love to just hear if the TAC has any insights or ideas that would help us along our way. And if you think that there's anything that we've described that either should be prioritized or deprioritized, that's helpful too. Go ahead, Pete.
I guess one question is, how do the colors come into play with all of this that you just talked about?
It's a good question, and that's one of the reasons why this is so important, because the colors are used obviously to define the 5 levels for each of status and change, and there's an overall color that reflects the combination in ways that Laura shared. But when it comes to setting an overall, when it comes to producing an overall index score and setting a cut on that, they aren't determined. There's no pattern of colors that determine that, which is why we have a standard setting. And as you've noted in previous meetings, and you're spot on, recall that those indicators bring different weights to this. So what you're looking, and so for elementary middle school, for example, assessment results in reading and math, science social studies and writing do most of the lifting, and the other indicators have a more modest influence. So the idea is to equip the standard setting panelists with as much context as possible, and to describe that as clearly as possible in those school performance level descriptors, and then have them look at the profile of colors along with their agreed upon performance level descriptors at the overall level to have them set the cut scores. But we definitely need to make sure that the way we combine an index score honors the weights, which is why some of the ideas that I shared with you are eventually around.
Right. I mean, the only why I asked about color is whether or not, and we can have different views on this. My view is that I think reporting and results should sort of be like an onion, I guess, or maybe something more tasty. So if you end up, because if the overall rating for the school is a color, then you're starting off with something that's very, very transparent, right? Blue is good and so on. And then the underlying ways that you get to that color can have increasing level of complexity, I think, versus if you have a score of 0.75 standard deviations above the state average, well, that's complex right from the get-go and has an affordance of getting people not to pay attention to it. So I think what that end result, if you can have the end result be very transparent and straightforward, I believe that buys you a little bit of flexibility in how you got to that color and in the terms of the kind of math you do to get there. So that's why I was thinking of that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that point. And of course, what we all know is there's a variety of ways to get to a color. And the way sort of conceptually this whole thing is intended to work is that you might even think of it as a typical or an archetypical profile that says, like, I should be able to think of a school with certain characteristics or that exhibits a certain pattern across those indicators and say, yep, that's a good example of a blue or a green or a yellow or something like that, even though that may not be the only way to get at that. That is a clear way for me to think about what's happening in the school that has that kind of characteristic. So I think you're absolutely right. I think leading with that and making sure that's the prominent message and that the complexity that's baked in sort of flows from there is a very, very wise way to think about this. Phoebe?
Yes, Phoebe Winter. This is just a thought that's not very gelled or anything yet. I haven't thought deeply about it, but I know that part of the reason for wanting to produce a good scale is so that there are straightforward interpretations of how to improve. So if I look at least by indicator by indicator, I'll understand what I need to do with each. And so I think about things like, I haven't figured it out, like for show, and it might not be how the scale is defined, but by showing the results of the scale. So it could like some kind of proportionality kind of thing, like how far am I from getting into a change score that's a positive one. Some kind of, and I know there are mathematical reasons that you can't use just p-values, but some people understand proportion, near far, a distance algorithm in the way you present results. And I'm not sure, again, I have not thought this through, so I'm not sure exactly how one would do it. Just that's kind of an off the wall comment, but I just wanted to throw it out there if you haven't thought about that kind of presentation yet.
About it certainly in a relative sense. And I don't know if we're overlapping or not, Phoebe, so help me if I'm not reflecting your advice back well. That, almost regardless of what we choose, whether it's a raw score or whether we scale it in some way, I do think people are going to ask, like, what does a 50 mean? What does a 70 mean? And I think having some way to answer that well, and maybe this is kind of what your point is too, Phoebe, is important to say, well, 50 is typical performance, 70 is something that is exceptional to this extent, which could be related to a percentile, or you could tether the scale to the ranges. So you could, you can set a floor and a ceiling at say the 95th and the 5th percentile, and so you would know that if you got the highest scale, then you were at the 95th percentile or higher, things of that. So, but I don't know, Phoebe, if I'm if my reflections are similar to what you wanted to bring to the conversation, or if you were coming at it from a little different angle.
It's somewhat like this, and again, I haven't thought of it from a math standpoint. So, but let's say, oh gosh, you know me and examples, they don't work very well. But if the width of change declined is, well, is that going to really be a width then? But let's say if there's 100 points to get to the next thing, whatever that thing might be. And that means that if I've gotten a quarter of the way through, if I've gotten 25, if my change has been 25 points, if it's going to take me 100 to get to the next level, this is not at all real. So you could say that you've moved towards change maintained, and you got a quarter of the points. Yeah, see, it's not quite, as you can tell, it's not really gelling.
I think I'm following you better now. That's helpful, CB. So let me say that back to, it sounds like almost like a percent of target achieved approach to say, this, if you're at green and you want to be blue, have some kind of sense for the distance and the percent of the target that you've achieved baked into the scale would be a way to help aid in interpretation. Maybe that's closer to honoring your point there.
Yeah, and it could be, you could do that with any scale, obviously, but so if you needed to, if you wanted to, for example, standardize the scale in some way, you could still, well, actually it'd be easier to do that. But yeah, that's what it is. And if it could be also, and that could be the same thing for any level of the onion, any skin of the onion you take off, you could have that same kind of interpretation. But again, from a mathematical and statistical perspective, I have no clue what that would look like. So, because I haven't thought there.
Maybe, thank you. That's a helpful idea for us to spend some time with. Elena?
This is Elena. Yeah, just to kind of thinking about what Phoebe was talking about, I think what's a little problematic about just thinking about straightforward calculations is you really have different kinds of onions. You're not talking about the same onion, you're talking about different onions for different types of schools. And then you're talking about different types of onions relative to, sorry, this onion metaphor can be taken only too far.
Go with it, Elena. It's looking fine. Yeah.
But you're also, again, talking about the characteristics or the properties of the different types of indicators, and that has very different influences on what you're looking at. So I'm also wondering about kind of the role of the improvement planning process to support this, because I think so much of that work in large part happens through the discussions when they unpack the sausage making, if you will, in order to better understand the elements, the performance, what is happening, how students are distributed across these different performance levels. I mean, so much of that really happens within the context of the improvement planning process. So I'm sure I know that happens. I'm not sure to what extent these new conversations that are happening now are becoming integrated. And I know a lot of this is still evolving, but I just want to make sure that there's a pin put into this, that there needs to be a lot of attention paid to the ways in which the system is being built, so that there's a better understanding of how then to create those types of guidance documents that can be used within the context of the improvement planning conversations that happened between the state, the district and schools. So I think that's a really important communication process to be thinking about now, as far as like, how do we help with some of the guidance materials that are developed so that folks can begin to have those types of conversations of unpacking the layers underneath and understanding how to think about moving the needle in relationship to the bigger picture.
Elena, that's excellent. I just want to reflect that back to make sure I honor your point. I think you're taking us even broader than just sort of the technical scaling decisions, but inviting us to ensure that whatever we do, we're communicating about performance, both with respect to status change and overall, in a way that really informs the improvement process, that people can use that and interpret that, and that can, and that goes back to what we were saying earlier about theory of action, that really fits into an idealized view about how these results can be used to help schools and students improve. And you also brought in the idea of guidance documents and other just resources being deployed to help in that process. So just reflecting that back, I appreciate that point. It's very critically important. Corinne?
Hi, this is kind of just a rudimentary thought, but we're brainstorming, right? And tagging on then to Elena, where regardless of how you do scale and all, I was thinking from the principal side, right? or superintendent. I'm wondering if this is also where, like, it could be nice to think about some sort of toggle system, just like we talked about for the panelists, that if they could see, well, if we do this, how do these things change? And I'm just thinking that if on their dashboard, assuming that's kind of how they're going to look at these colors for my overall and my indicator, if they could really think, okay, well, if we were to increase our graduation rate by this much next year, what would change to our overall score and our overall status? And I just don't know if that would be kind of a helpful feature. It's more of like a technology piece, but something where they can really kind of hypothesize changes that they could, like, what should we aim for then for our graduation rate to improve this overall status, or what should we aim for these things? That could be something really helpful on their end that I think they might play around with and really set some goals with.
That's helpful, thank you. And what I hear you say is people need to understand how changes in scores at the unit level or the indicator level impact overall outcomes. And yeah, but it also kind of takes us back to the point then that if the scale doesn't in some way address, I'm just going to call it consistency for now, there's probably other words I could use, then if we're not careful, we could create some unintended negative consequences there. They could say, you might have something really meaningful and exceptional that happens over here with one indicator that yields very little in terms of a score change, but you have something that is has much more of an impact. And again, we want to make sure that we incent the right behaviors in the right ways. And so, yeah, I'm appreciating your comment, and I'm bringing in this whole, let's make sure it helps promote the kinds of outcomes that we really prioritize in the state.
Yeah, you might have noticed I raised my hand and then I took it down. I started thinking, well, then are they going to game system? But when I come back to the principal's perspective, I think what can be really frustrating is that you make goals, you target things, and it's not reflected in it. We do meet some target that we set, and yet things aren't changing in our overall, I don't want to say score. Well, no, you're calling it that. The overall score and the way that we thought it would. But yeah, it is a balance. You don't want them to game, but you want them to use data-driven decisions too to change these outcomes for themselves. So it's somewhere in between, you know.
Well said. Thank you. Other comments or ideas from the TAC? These are very helpful. Pete, please go ahead. Pete, you might be on mute.
Too many things at the same time. All right. The only other, and you've probably thought of this, and you mentioned this at the beginning, but I don't think you were telling us which way you were leaning in terms of what we've talked about previously in terms of the nominal weights and the actual operational weights, whether or not, because I know there's policy guidance, but is that going to be interpreted as meaning the nominal weights, or is that going to be interpreted as meaning the effective weights?
Very good question. So when at the indicator level, we're operating off the assumption that, because remember, every indicator, let's just take reading and math performance, is an equal it's supposed to be equal source of change in status. And in order to honor that, presumably those need to be on a similar scale. And there's a couple ways to do that. You could standardize each of those, or you could just, I call them effective ranges. You could create effective ranges for each of those scales that are similar, because, for example, we talk about the theoretical range for reading and math achievement is 0 to 125, but the effective range is probably somewhere closer to 30 to 75. And so in order to really honor both nominal and effective weights, then having similar effective ranges for status and change become important. So merging those two in that fashion, I think, gets at what you're inviting us to think about. Honestly, it's a lot more complicated when it gets to the overall level, not from a nominal sense, because from a nominal sense, you could just do a weighted composite. This value times 0.51 plus this value times 0.40, so forth. But we know that the effective weights they're governed by variability. If one of them has more variability, then it's going to have more of an effective weight. Taken to an extreme, if everything's a constant and one thing varies, then that one thing determines everything. So that's the challenge that we get to when it comes to the overall. So we'll certainly bake in the nominal weights with the weighted composite, but I think we'll just have to pay attention to the variability and see how well those nominal weights are being known.
Yep, exactly.
Suzanne?
I think this discussion has been very rich, and it is apparent that you folks at the center have done a lot of thinking about this. I also think it's important to make sure that things are as transparent as possible for those in the system. I liked the idea that was brought up by one of my fellow TAC members in terms of how do you look within the system to think about what I need to do and to set goals. So whatever you can do in thinking about scaling and presenting the information to be as transparent as possible and to aid the users in thinking about how to use the data to make improvements in their own schools, to help with improving student learning for the different groups involved, etc. But, I really appreciate all the work that you folks at the center have done in thinking about these issues.
Thank you, Suzanne. Very helpful. Well, we're a little past the time I think that we had targeted to wrap this up, but since there seems to be a natural pause here, maybe I'll ask Brian if you feel like this is a good time to break, or but I'll pass the baton back to you, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you to the KTAC members for your comments and suggestions, and we appreciate it very much. If you have anything in addition, feel free to email me, and we'll be sure that those get considered. Rhonda, what if we take a 20-minute break now to take us to 1:30, and then we'll come back and take up the assessment, the two topics on the agenda regarding the assessment system, and then we'll bring Bill Audi and get his slides set up. Is that all right?
I think that sounds great, Brian.
Okay.
Sounds like a good
We'll
plan.
Thank you. We'll see everyone at 1:30 then.
At 1:30. Thank you.
Thank you, Center folks. Everyone, welcome back to our June meeting of the Kentucky Technical Advisory Committee. And if we advance the slide, we'll get ready for our next agenda item. It's going to be led by Bill Audi, and Bill will ask you to introduce yourself and then proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Brian. Bill Audi. I'm a consultant with the Kentucky Department of Education, working primarily with psychometric services. Good to be with you. Good to see old friends also. We wanted to give the TAC an overview of the assessment system, just primarily as context. I know as I've been on TACs, it's sometimes hard to keep track of all the design elements that are just sort of the system. And this is intended as an introduction overview of that, and then the slides as a reference document for your use. The Kentucky Summative Assessment is its formal title, KSA abbreviation, is a custom designed assessment for Kentucky, and the current contractor is Pearson. It is aligned to the Kentucky academic standards that some may have known Kentucky as a core curriculum state, and it was, and they have been gone through one cycle of revision since then, so they are considered to be specific Kentucky academic standards. The assessments, KSA meets state and federal testing requirements, and probably you could say that in any state. However, I wanted to make the point that Kentucky has had a comprehensive statewide assessment for many years in preceding ESSA and NCLB. And as you heard in the discussion of the accountability system, the legislature has been always very much involved in the specifications and design of the assessment, and that is the case here. So there are constraints both from federal and state law on our system. The KSA is administered grades 3 through 8 and 10 or 11 on an annual basis. We have reading and mathematics at grades 3 through 8 and 10. And Brian mentioned earlier, I'll say again, that reading and not writing is included as the ESSA accountability assessment. Science, social studies, on-demand writing, and editing mechanics are all specified in state law and required assessments in the grades that are noted there, generally once in elementary, middle, and high school. And the test is administered online, computer administered. There are some paper adaptations available, but most students take it online. This is a fixed form administration. The engine does have the capacity to do adaptive, but that has been considered, and we don't have immediate plans to go that route. It's always a possibility in the future. The other similar issue is immediate reporting. We're working towards that. At the moment, we still rely on post-equating, and so there aren't immediate feedback options. The alternative assessment is the AKSA. It's also custom designed for Kentucky by the University of Kentucky. And as above, it's aligned to the standards. It's guided by state and federal requirements, testing at the same grades and in the same subjects. The test is organized as attainment tasks, which are performance events, and the students work through a task guided by the teacher. And then the students' responses, which are essentially multiple response choices, are recorded online by the teacher. I probably don't need to say it, but please interrupt if you have questions at any point. It's not an interruption, it's part of the plan. There are some other additional state required assessments. The ACT, again, some with memory of the state, ACT was served as the high school ESSA assessment. It is not now. The legislation requires that the state choose a college admissions vendor exam and that all students in grade 11 must take it, so it's made available to them. As part of the alternate KSA, there's a transition attainment record, which is essentially the mirror of, in this case, the ACT. So the same subject, and it's in grade 11 with retakes available for students. And it's based on teacher observation of student performance throughout the year. So it's not a single event assessment. Suzanne?
Thank you. I was just wondering, is the ACT used for accountability purposes at all, or is that just for trying to promote students to take the college entrance exam?
Since we've got the center here, Brian, is ACT one of the indicators at all in the accountability system?
I think students can use the scores from ACT as well as other tests as part of qualifying for post-secondary readiness. But those are, it's a menu of items, so it's not a required thing for every student.
Okay. Then for English language learners, there is access and alternate access, which are products of the WEDA consortium, of which Kentucky is a part. And there's also a common kindergarten entry screener, which is the Brigance. And the standards are set primarily from that published test. So those are the state required assessments. The Kentucky law, as I was saying earlier, establishes a process for creation, review, and revision of standards and assessments. And there's a 6-year review for each subject, a little bit disrupted by COVID. Science is nearing completion right now. This is an extensive review that's mandated by the legislature and includes reports to the legislature, state board, and their representative committees. I think it is 3 or 4 committees per subject area with an overarching committee. These are all representative of different groups across the state. And so it's a fairly established and rigorous process to ensure that the standards include educators and interested parties in the state, and that all are aware of what's going on. The specific requirements of the statute are that this is it should be criterion referenced assessment. There must be an on-demand writing assessment. There's an editing mechanics test that is related to writing, and that is in its 2nd year. There must be both constructed response and multiple choice items. The weighting was, but is no longer specified. Just have to be some constructed response, some multiple choice. And then the assessments are to be administered during the last 14 days of district calendar. So there's not a single statewide administration window. It is specific to when schools end. That means it's mostly taking place in May. And this is something you'll probably be hearing about. There are validation studies mandated, and that there's a report to the Legislative Research Commission every year. So that's part of the oversight of the system. The psychometric support for the KSA and AKSA provided by Pearson Education, the Center for Assessment. They do, as you've seen, accountability design and KTEC management. Education Measurement Consulting, which is me, provides general support. Human Resources Research Organization, general psychometric support, also third-party scoring, scaling, and equating validation. And you'll be hearing from Art on some of their work later. And Cavion Test Security also reviews the KSA and does some analysis, and has also been supportive in terms of creating policies and procedures for test security. Some brief notes generally about the modeling of the assessments. In KSA, we use Roche and partial credit for the multiple choice and open response. As you heard in, well, it's been over a year now, we use matrix sampled forms for content coverage. And that supports group subscale reporting, not individual. The subscales are just simple subsets of the items, and so they're on the same scale as the overall assessment. We use within year and year-to-year equating based on common item linking. And for on-demand writing, each student responds to a single prompt, and within a year there are 2 anchor forms from the previous year and 2 non-anchor forms. And we rely on randomly equivalent group design to essentially administering it to a random students as the means for linking forms. There are grade and genre specific 4-point rubrics with multiple scoring elements or traits, we call them elements. And there's a human and a machine scored with a 0.8 raw score. And then we can use Roche to create scale scores from the trait scores. There are lots of ways to do writing. That's how we do it. Pete?
Sorry. So when you say there's human and AI scoring, does that mean there's AI scoring with human follow scores, or I'm not quite sure what that combination is?
No, the total raw score for the student is based on one set from the machine and one set from human readers. The machine is annually trained to those prompts from human responses. Kentucky Teacher, the same sample of evaluators or readers. And I think that's it. Did that answer it, Pete? I guess so. Suzanne?
What are the criteria if there are differences among the human and the machine score?
Well, it's
I can assist with that if you'd like.
Oh, go ahead.
So the way that basically if there is a non-correlated, or basically if there's a an alignment from the computer-based score to the human score, then they'll bring in a scoring supervisor, Suzanne, that will then go through and score it again for a third time, and they will apply that score based upon that correlation there. So technically, if there's any type of disagreement, if you will, or unagreement, if you will, then they'll bring in a scoring supervisor to apply it.
And there are also provisions for monitoring human raters during the process such that they can be disqualified in their result. If they drift too far off or erratic, they can be replaced as raters. Suzanne?
Thank you very much. Are there constructed response items, the smaller items on the assessments, are they scored by an automated scoring engine, or are they humanly scored?
There's mixture. There are some selected response items that can be scored by algorithm on the computer, and others that are text created by students that are read and rated by humans.
It would be interesting at some point to look at, what are the criteria used for, like you said, for the writing. If there's any discrepancy, it sounds like there's a third rater, but what's actually being done for all of the scoring engines for the constructed response as well as the writing, and the criteria used for making decisions if agreement is good enough. And just knowing how well the algorithms are scoring the shorter constructed responses would be useful. As a future topic, it would be of interest to see.
Noted. I mean, that is, we do have reports and data from the contractors on that, and we can certainly put together something for you. So we'll take that down as a future topic. Yeah, it was a several-year process to go with computer AI scoring, and we did multiple tests and were assured of its reliability, essentially matched to human scoring. Anything else? For the alternate, we used a 2PL model, and that's new. This, in the past, the procedure had been to essentially reconvene a standard setting group each year to look at the raw scores and essentially validate or reestablish the same, intended to be the same cut scores on the new test. We're moving this year for the first time to statistical equating from year to year. And so given the uncertainty of the sort of immediate post-COVID last year, we're going to establish the scale this year, and then we'll back equate to 2022 to pick up the raw score standards that were set last year, and then apply those to the new scale. And from then on, use year-to-year equating common item based. Any questions there? Should be straightforward, but we're right in the process of it now. The transition attainment record, which is the ACT correlate for alternate assessment, uses raw scores, and it's a common form or procedure across years. So there's no specific equating of that. And the next three slides are essentially, I guess, a summary and index into the Kentucky website. It's actually very easy to follow, but we thought it would be useful to you to have links directly to the various parts so that you can take this slide and connect directly, jump right to what you're looking at. So there's the assessment section, accountability, all of the work that the center's doing and more. And these are the sort of administration procedures, things to do with assessment irregularities, all those meetings and committees and so forth. Pete?
And this may have just been a personal thing. I don't know if all of these links have been checked recently, because when I went on one of them, there was some issue. May have been my connection or my laptop acting funny with that particular link, but just to raise it up there to make sure they're all checked.
Yeah, if you want to send that to me, we'll get out a correction. It was done 2 weeks ago, so it's but I didn't check it today.
Right, it may have just been a personal problem.
Right. Suzanne?
Thank you for sending these links. I didn't look at everything, but I did look at a few things, and two of the documents that I looked at were the reports for the general assessment, the technical report for the general, and the alternate assessment. And I just had some general comments. I don't know if this is the time or place, but when we're thinking about modifications for the report, and please let me know if you would like these comments now or I can hold off.
You're one slide ahead of me, so let me bring everyone up so that we can do. So what I'm doing now is actually going to the next. Oh, sorry, the next thing these are research reports. And we're going to bring this back to you as a formal topic in terms of the assessments. But I did, and Suzanne already found, the technical manuals for the KSA, and Pearson produces those documents. And it's a fairly stable format and will continue. And it's generally in the technical manual overview and then a yearbook of specific data. The AKSA technical manual will remain somewhat the same, but the technical information will change because of the scaling this year. And to foreshadow one of the questions we might ask is, when I put that together, I organized the technical data by test rather than by statistic. So for example, if you go to reading, there'll be a section for reading third grade, and all of the stats are for together, as opposed to looking for conditional standard error measure and all the tests are there. I think that's more useful to the people that might be revising the test, but it could be less useful to peer review and other outside observers. So Suzanne, what were your questions?
Yeah, I really appreciated all of the information in both of the technical reports and how comprehensive they were. And I especially liked the alternate assessment technical report because they discuss a theory of action and then claims within the theory of action and talk about the interpretation and use argument with respect to those particular claims. And one of the things I thought that could in the future be modified for the KSA technical manual is to think a little more deeply about what is the theory of action, what are the specific claims, and then not to use just Keynes' interpretive argument, because that precedes his JEM article where he discusses an interpretation and use argument, and that should be followed. I like the way that both of them include the argument approach to validity, but I also think it could be done a little bit better and stronger in the KSA technical manual. And I think it's useful to bring up the interpretation and use argument in the beginning of the document, not just to have like the validity chapter later on in the document where all the information that's in the technical manual really speaks to evidence for one's interpretation and use argument. And if we have a chance to look at these again in the future, and it's going to be a topic, I'd be more than happy to provide additional comments. But thanks for hearing me out now.
Very good. Yes, you will get an opportunity. I can't promise that you'll see that particular recommendation in the 2023 data. That, with large organizations, those templates are done, I imagine. But it's certainly, I get the point. I take the point, and it is a good way to go in the future. Thank you. So that slide represents one of the shorter presentations you'll ever hear, because that is it for me. I don't know whether we need a break if this has gone shorter than you intended, Brian. Oh, Phoebe has a question.
Yes, this is Phoebe. I scanned the technical manual but didn't look at it closely enough to see if there's any more detail on the matrix sampling part, or is that something that's coming up?
That there is at least a description of it. So yes, it should be there.
Okay, okay. I didn't have time to read the whole, to scour the whole report, but
and as I said, we are intending to we do want to formally get feedback and feed forward on these manuals. So this is the opportunity to sort of give you a first look at where we've been, and then I think the plan is when we get drafts in the fall of 2023, we'll share those, and hopefully
well, is this an appropriate, I'm sorry, is this an appropriate time to ask for more detail about the matrix sampling design and how the scores are used, or is that for later?
That probably would fit into a later. I don't want to do it off the top of my head, but we can certainly do it the next time. Brian's shaking. Actually, I should say Brian's nodding his head, so I think we can okay. Do that. It's much simpler than it was the last time we talked about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate KTAC members looking at the materials and thinking about this. The intention of this was to give an orientation to the very large body of documentation, and then but not to have a detailed discussion of it at this time, but just to alert people. So between now and may not even come up at our next meeting, which is a little bit shorter, but it may be the fall meeting, which is longer, when we'll go into more detail, and you'll have had much more time to look at things. But so Phoebe, if you have a chance to look at it and you still have questions, I think that would be an appropriate thing to let people know ahead of the next time when we discuss it. And I think, as Bill said, we discussed the interaction between the matrix sampling and score reporting 3 or 4 TAC meetings ago, and it sounds like there's been an update on that. So hopefully when we see the technical documentation, we'll get an understanding of that and then be able to build our questions off of it.
Thank you.
And Bill, I appreciate your showing us the overall picture. I think we may not be able to discuss in depth every assessment program at the next meeting. We may focus, for example, on the general assessment, and then we may do the alternate assessment in a subsequent meeting, depending on how much documentation we have in other agenda items. The intention here was to have the KTAC get an introduction, and then we will build in a sort of regular review of the programs as we go. But Kentucky has a large assessment program, so we may not be able to do that all at once. Keith?
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking what you just said in terms of going into more depth, I think it would be very useful to, if you take the general, let's say the general assessment, and you go through all of the build up, the field testing and the scoring and the quizzing and all of that. But also I think it's important then to have some examples and goals and examples of the actual reporting that's done out to stakeholders, so that we can see where you're trying to get to with all of the pieces that bleed up to it, and see if it's coherent.
Oh, great, thank you. So Bill, I think you had reports on as one of the set of links.
Yeah,
so
this is
those are-
for supportive resources. There is, I'm trying to think where the,
if it's not on
I don't
the
think
if it's not on the set of links, then we can work with the department, because the department has a number of resources to help people both understand reports and see the different reports. So we'll make sure that that's as part of the body of things that KTAC has access to.
yeah, it's a fairly extensive, there's both a report card, there's a variety of resources. So we'll get that together for you.
Were you thinking of things reporting that sometimes are not public, things like reports that go to educators that might be accessible through a portal but not public?
Yeah, I was thinking of both that and student reports to parents, individuals.
Okay.
So that's it for me as far as I know. And so, Brian, I'll turn it back to you. Transition.
Bill, you're so fast. I don't think we need a break. Looks like we'll end early today. Why don't we go on to, if there aren't any other questions or comments from the TAC members, then we can go on to the presentation and discussion of the work by HUMRO. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
And Art is at the beginning. If you would just reintroduce yourself and I don't know if you have any colleagues with you today, but we appreciate your being here.
Oh, sure. Hi, folks. I'm Art Thacker. I work for HUMRO, and I provide some technical support on sort of all of the work that we do for KDE. And I'm going to talk today about our research plan for 23-24. And I've hit take control, so hopefully this will work. Yeah, there's a slide. So can you guys see that? All right, excellent. All right, so like I say, I'm going to talk about these things. I'm going to go very quickly through the things that we do annually. These are studies that we conduct every year. They don't change from year to year. I've reported on them several times. They are primarily, sort of in the world of quality assurance and sort of routine psychometric analyses. But I'll quickly, sort of go through them. So every year we do third-party checking of the summative assessment, scaling and equating. And we do that for the regular assessment, and we do that for the alternate assessment. So the psychometric processing that Pearson does and that the University of Kentucky does and that Bill works on, we do in parallel with them, and we make sure that we all get the same answers before we send out score reports. We also do analyses for the Quality of School Climate and Safety Survey, and we conduct, research on the stability and reliability of that survey every year. We conduct student classification accuracy analyses every year. And like I say, those things happen routinely. So I've talked about them before, so I'm not going to spend time on them today. But there are some things that we're going to plan to do. Yeah, go ahead.
This is Brian. Sorry to interrupt. Where are those results that of HMRO's work included in the technical manuals, or are they in a separate place?
We generate specific reports on the work that we do. In the past, Pearson has referenced that work in the technical manual. I'm not sure if they're doing that currently, but there are standalone reports that are delivered to KDE. We stay very sort of separate from Pearson, but
right.
but they should land parallel whenever Pearson reports the results. We should reference that those results have been checked by a third party and verified, and all is well. So hopefully that's what's happening in the technical manuals. So all right. So next year we plan on doing some research related to the career and technical education and of program assessments, or CTE EOP research. We conduct validity studies every year. Those are defined by KDE, and we carry them out. And I'll talk about sort of what we're doing under that topic for this year in just a moment. We're going to look at some consistency across measures. And these are topics that are included in our contract. So we sort of define the studies under these big headings. And then school classification accuracy. So we do student classification accuracy every year. We investigate school classification accuracies in sort of alternating years, and then we do research on the accountability system itself. So for the career and technical education research this year, we're going to spend some time leading some subject matter experts in a review of items flagged for differential item functioning. This follows on to some research we did last year where we computed diff for the items on the CTE assessments, and now we're going to help establish some criteria for flagging items for elimination or for additional review. And we're also going to help them identify assessments where diff is not an appropriate indicator for enhanced bias and sensitivity review, and we'll sort of help them figure out how to define what that means. So the CTE tests often have very few kids take them. So there are some popular ones that have a lot of kids where you can compute diff and it's a reasonable measure. There are others that may have 5 or 10 kids, and diff is not a reasonable measure if you have 5 or 10 kids. But there are some things that you can do even when diff is not an appropriate indicator. We've done a few of those things. So there are some items that occur across tests, and so we look at cross tests to compute diff for those. And then once you identify items that exhibit diff, you can look for sort of similar item structures and things like that in tests where you don't have enough students. Suzanne, you have a question?
Thanks, Art. This is Suzanne Lane. Some states are beginning to look at person fit in a way to think about differential performance that might indicate unfairness for certain groups of students, where they might group the person fit statistics by groups to characterize, the fit for the actual subgroup. And I was wondering if Kentucky is thinking about this approach.
Whether Kentucky is thinking about that approach or not is an excellent question for KDE. I'm not sure. We've used that approach in the past. So some of the work that HMRO did long ago and far away for the PARC consortium, we looked at using person fit in exactly that kind of way. It doesn't fix the issue of having very few kids that take some of the tests. But it is a different lens that you can sort of look at the way the test is functioning for different groups through. But so far we've not done that in Kentucky. But it is a thing that we can do. All right, moving on. So we're still working on a validity framework for the Kentucky Accountability System. That framework that we're working on will be designed to parallel peer review requirements, not because we really love the peer review requirements, but because it makes it easy for Kentucky to present that stuff to the federal government whenever they submit their peer review. That framework will extend beyond the peer review to incorporate intended interpretations and uses that are specific to Kentucky, things like change. And not surprisingly, we are, sort of working on that as Kentucky finalizes the way that their accountability system will work and establishes, sort of really clear interpretation and use guides. So as those become more clear, we'll become more solid in the way that we construct that, and then we'll, sort of build the studies to support those interpretations. And yes, there's a question.
Yes, just a minor comment. I'm not sure if you were here for the full meeting, but we did just talk about, how to help principals, anybody interpret these change scores that are coming out, given the way they're calculated or other ways they could be calculated. And I definitely think it would help when you're there if it is very explicit what the claims are that one can make from the change score. That's just a really hard part for interpretation we were discussing. And that could be one way to, I don't know if it's transparent, but it certainly has a lot of interpretive value. And especially with the uses, how can I use this information? So I even maybe recommend, since you're just beginning this, to use some, to ask stakeholders, how do they want to use them? How do they think they can use them, and see if the claims can align with that, or if some of those claims can be validated much more than others, which would help them to understand sometimes too some kind of layman claims that might not have validity evidence behind them and that they should veer away from, things like that.
Thank you very much. And later on, I'll talk about some of the ways that we are, sort of looking at the change scores. But we have not planned to do, sort of what you suggest, and I think that's a good idea. So thanks, Suzanne.
Suzanne Lane, I really like that idea, Corinne. And I also think it would be useful is not only to discuss what are some intended interpretations or uses, but also, what are some misinterpretations and how should you not use any type of score, whether it being change score, status score, etc. But I think that, thinking about what are the possible misuses and misinterpretations and really specifying that too, just to be out there to help avoid any perhaps negative consequences.
Thank you. Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. I think we should pay attention to that. Absolutely. All right, let's move on. We're going to look at consistency across time and measures and do some analyses. And we're going to look at the relations between school status and change scores for that study. So we're going to analyze whether there are patterns of difference among schools with different proportions of disaggregated student group members. So one of the reasons people adopt change scores is they often show lower differential impact than status scores, and for a variety of reasons. But we want to take a look at that and sort of help Kentucky, understand how those how the change scores and how the status scores differ in the way that you can interpret them for schools with different proportions of students in those disaggregated groups. And the data that we'll take a look at, we'll look at data disaggregated by race, ethnicity, by socioeconomics, by English language status, and disability status. And so we've done that for a couple of other states, and it's been enlightening to take a look at the way that the patterns of scores when you look at change versus status differ across schools, and how those differences are played out whenever you look at disaggregations of student groups. And Suzanne?
In addition, and when sample size allows it, it might be useful to look at these patterns across some of the interactions with these groups, race and SES, etc. Example would be one. But I always think, we all know that these are very coarse group identifiers, and whatever we can do to help provide additional meaning by what we mean by a group would be useful. Thank you, Art.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's again a good suggestion. We'll take a look and see what kind of group sizes we've got and how much of that we can do, how much is feasible. I don't know who was first. I've got questions from Corinne and Phoebe. Corinne, let's start there.
I myself was just debating if the numbers 1 and 2 are meaningful here in front of me. So could you describe what you mean by the second bullet? I don't, are you just being general that change measures in general have a differential impact? Or are you being specific to the way that change is being thought of in KDE? And what is the difference? I just need a little explanation. I'm not sure I understand that.
Oh, sure. There are a couple of ways that you can sort of calculate an effect size whenever you look at change scores. And you can look at effect size for groups from, one period to the next. And then you can also look at sort of the effect size in terms of the differential performance of one group versus the other in terms of status. And typically, whenever you compute those effect sizes, like I said, for a variety of reasons, one of which is change scores tend to be less reliable. You tend to see smaller effect sizes whenever you look at differential impact by group when you look at change scores. So just sort of understanding how that works, what you should expect, and how to interpret whenever you do see those differences, I think is what we're after here. And Phoebe, I think you were next.
Yes, I'm gonna. Corinne kind of started the question I wanted to ask, and that was, can you? I guess I think it's always interesting to look at these differences to kind of help understand context. But how do inferences and interpretations change? I hate to use that word. Oh, how are inferences and interpretations and actions different based on these different looks at the data? So can you give an example, maybe English language, for example? If you see something that could be interpreted differently when you're looking at change in status, what would that be? And this is something that might need a little more thought, and what kind of action might be taken based on those differences?
Right. I'm not sure about what sort of action differences that, might be taken at this stage. I think that'll kind of depend on the, sort of the guidance that KDE puts out and the way that, schools and districts are instructed to interpret the change scores versus the status scores. And this study is, we just want to sort of start off by setting some baseline expectations so that whenever you do build out, what to expect, what actions that you can make, you sort of start that from a place of understanding and knowledge. I don't, at this stage, we haven't gone down the path of sort of deciding what interpretations might mean when to, sort of back off on interpretations when the status and change indicators give different stories. But sort of knowing that they could give different stories and understanding sort of where those boundaries are is what we're hoping for at this stage. Hopefully we'll get to the kinds of things that you're talking about as we, collect some data over a year or two. But I don't have a good answer for you right now, Phoebe.
My suggestion is, and this is probably what you're going to do anyway, because it's pretty common sense, is before the data gets published and shown around, and that those ideas of how one should interpret them and what they mean. And I guess by expectations, you're thinking more statistically than expectations in terms of performance and what kids are going to do. So being careful to couch all the research in appropriate ways in terms of what the meaning of it is until you've had a chance to do some more research about what actions might help, et cetera.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Pete?
Yeah, two things. One's a comment and then one's well, I guess they're both comments. So first I wanted to go back to your response of the second bullet about change measures. And of course you gave the technically appropriate response, but I just wanted to add for some folks for whom that may have been less clear, not the TAC members, other folks, that an example of that would be if we think about summer learning loss. So a lot of times students, let's say economically disadvantaged students, demonstrate much more summer learning loss. And so when they come back back into school in the next year, they're at a lower level. And so if we just look at levels of performance, we see bigger gaps between the students. However, the learning that occurs within the school year from when they got in to when they leave actually runs in parallel. And so economically disadvantaged students and their non-disadvantaged classmates are gaining at the same rate. And so there's not a gap in the gain. The gaps in the levels are caused by what's happening out of school. And so that's why we see differential impact from status scores and growth scores. So that was one comment. And the second comment is you list a lot of individual factors that are important to look at, and I agree. I think the other thing you and maybe you are considering them is to think about aggregate school factors or characteristics that might be related to or have some systematic differences across the schools. So obvious ones, of course, are things like school level, elementary versus high school, whether change is equally likely to occur at the same levels, especially now given the new metric that's being created in high schools and elementary schools, and other aggregate school factors that shouldn't but may account for some of the differences that you see.
That's an excellent suggestion. Thank you very much. And Phoebe, you have another question? Okay. All right, let me move on. So school classification accuracy, we'll evaluate the reliability and validity of Kentucky's school accountability classifications. This year, we're focusing on the impact of adding change indicators to the calculation of overall accountability scores. And we'll evaluate the accuracy, reliability of the change indicator compared to that of the status indicator, and then look at how that impacts the overall classification accuracy for schools. So, okay. For accountability research, we plan to evaluate the relative impact of change compared to status, like we said before, and understanding whether adding change to the accountability model is having the intended effects. So we'll start by looking at sort of the overall classification accuracy. We also want to sort of monitor over time the impact of adding change to the overall school scores. We want to look at the between and within school variability on the quality of school climate and safety survey. So far, the results for the quality and climate survey have been really consistent and fairly reasonable, but we want to make sure that that those really consistent and fairly reasonable data that we get at the school level are sort of played out whenever we look within school. And especially we wanted to conduct some outlier analysis to determine if there are small groups of students within schools that show disparate or particularly negative effects or results, not effects, but results. So that's a thing that we haven't done so far. Like I say, we've done a lot of analysis of the quality of the overall quality of the survey, but we know that there are still kids in Kentucky that are exhibiting issues. So we want to see if we can sort of parse that data differently and maybe sort of help tease some of that stuff out. Additionally, we want to identify a sample of schools for conducting site visits to sort of look at the accountability research. So to talk to those schools about their accountability, we're going to develop some observational and interview protocols in collaboration with KDE staff, and then conduct a small number of visits and train KDE staff to conduct additional visits. And this is to, again, look a little deeper at the results of those quality of school climate and safety survey results. And ideally, at the end of this, we would have a set of tools that we could hand off to KDE, and then they could hand those off to districts, so districts could, conduct their own investigations and sort of look at the way that their own schools are functioning in relation to the school climate and safety. And Suzanne, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm not sure how you're identifying these schools and if it's just based on the surveys, but in thinking about observing schools, I always wonder, like, what's the purpose? What message do you want to provide to other schools? And, I'm thinking about those schools that might not be performing very well in terms of status, but have shown, considerable growth and, trying to identify what are the features within that school that might be transferable and generalizable for other schools and kind of in the same background or context. I'd like to hear more, I guess, like, what is the purpose of this and what do you want to provide?
The way that we have planned sort of to identify schools for conducting observations so far is to look at the patterns on the school climate and safety survey. So we're looking for outliers. We're looking for, sort of weirdness in terms of the within school variability. And then from there, we'll develop a sample of schools to sort of help get at some of that, sort of understanding some of those kinds of outliers in that data. So that's as far as I've gotten at this stage. I don't have I don't have a list of schools. Ideally we would identify a small group of schools at various levels, sort of elementary, middle, and high, and but we're only visiting a really small number. So we're not going to wind up having sort of representativeness for the state. And that's sort of where we are at this stage. The schools, we've heard feedback from KDE and others that the schools sort of want to be able to look a little deeper than just the mean results that they get from their school climate and safety survey. And this is sort of a way to approach that or to work toward that. And I've got a couple of questions. Pete, I think you were first. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think it would be useful to see what the relationship is between your school quality results and some other outcomes that are of interest to the department, such as academic outcomes or graduation rates. I mean, in most of the work that I've looked at or I've done, you always tend to find pretty meaningful relationships, and I think it brings up potentially one of two things. One, if you find some significant relationships, which I expect you would, I think that makes it becomes a good avenue for supporting the use and importance of school quality and elements of school quality and climate, because you can advertise how, if students are in schools where they feel safe and are allowed to be themselves and so on, those are schools in which performance tends to be better. And if principals and superintendents only care about performance, having these kinds of results demonstrates that some of the inputs are important as well. And on the flip side, if you find no relationships, then you can ask yourself why it is, if you expected to find relationships, what it is about your survey that's not picking up those things that may be meaningful to relating to overall success for students.
Those are great suggestions, and we have done a lot of the research that you talk about at the beginning. So we have looked at the relationships between the climate and survey results at the school level and other academic indicators, and not surprisingly, there is a relationship there. And so yeah, that's a great suggestion, and we'll follow through with that. Elena, I think you were next, right?
Thank you. This is Elena. I really appreciate the fact that you are doing these kind of observational visits. I think it's really important to supplement a lot of these kind of quantitative indicators that appear to try to quantify, if you will, school quality, but it doesn't really share a richness, this underlying stories of it. So I think it's really important. But going back to what Suzanne was raising, this is only about the school climate piece, and that's actually, that's a big thing to handle right there. When you think about the types of processes that support school climate, if we're, for example, looking at the multi-tiered system of supports that are in place and how that's actually enacted, how that looks like, how that's implemented, those are all facets that also play into how school climate is structured in each of these schools. But I think it's also important to think about then how do we think about the broader storyline to include, for example, the bright spots? What does that look like within the context of, say, the accountability results? And how do we think about it in relationship to that? Again, I hear a lot about coherence and that term being thrown around in different ways, but in some ways, if the storylines that appear from these types of investigations seem to move into a very different direction or unearth a lot of information that seems somewhat inconsistent with the messages that are happening from the quantitative indicators, I think it's something to think about, and at least it provides an area of what do we need to do to really unpack the story that we're trying to tell about school quality and what does that mean?
Thank you. Good advice, and I aspire to sort of meet those expectations. I hope that our site visits can do the kinds of things that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I realize these are small, but I just want to emphasize it would be really important perhaps to think about these as regular routines to incorporate as part of the type of work that you're doing to support the validation of these accountability pieces, because I think it's important to understand, unpack what are the types of supports that are happening, to what extent are we seeing these types of again, going back to this notion of theory of action, how are we seeing the things that we're expecting to see supported by the system come to play or come to fruition at these different schools that we're seeing, for example, high levels of growth, but they may be at low status. I think these types of examples are just really helpful for the field. They may not generalize across all contexts, but the good thing is that it provides areas for, say, principled adaptations, like how do we actually adapt some of these things for different contexts?
Right. I completely agree, and I hope that we can visit schools, especially as schools begin to use the new data and sort of function in the new accountability system. I think it'll be really important to sort of dig in and see how they're using that information and what they're doing with it and how they're using it to change every aspect of their schools. So thank you very much for all the suggestions. I really appreciate it. And that is the end of my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing, stop presenting, I guess, and hand the reins back over to someone else. And yes, thank you very much.
I'll
I really
re-upload the
appreciate it.
PowerPoint.
Oh, did I close out of it? I'm
No
sorry.
worries.
I have never done the take control, and it was too much control for me. I apologize. So,
Pete, do you have a comment or question?
I do, and I guess it's a question of the role that you all want the TAC to play in all of these studies, because I know in some states we get a little more. So this is a great overview of the study of the various studies, and we've had some discussions. But in some states, when an outside group proposes to do some studies, they give us a little more detail on the methodology, so that we can weigh in. Obviously, we're not designing a study for HumRO, but just to get some sense of some of the details that potentially impact the claims that can be made based on the results. So maybe that's something you don't want the TAC to weigh in on, but I think it would be a reasonable thing. I think it's a reasonable thing to think about.
Art and KDE folks, that's probably something that you need to discuss, not here. and then, and then we
Yeah.
can come back and build into the TAC agenda whatever the appropriate things. I think that the TAC members sounds like both qualified and interested in contributing in various ways. And I know Art, the HUMRO schedule is sort of an advanced planned one. There's both a longer planning thing and it's because it's going to the legislature, the research office. There's sometimes less flexibility once things are stated. So if the TAC would certainly have to work within whatever constraints that you have, but I'm sure that we could schedule things to do that if that's something that you and the department find useful.
Yeah, and I'm happy to, sort of work with the department to, provide the, whatever level of detail, they think is appropriate. I'm all for that. So I think we got good feedback and good recommendations today. So if more of that will only make our studies better. So I'm all for that.
Okay. I wanted to ask one question, and maybe that it's really for Rhonda and her group. As Elena was saying, and I guess other folks have mentioned it, the educational endeavor about trying to figure out how to help make things better, and in particular find some leverage points for some of the really difficult and challenging problems that different states or districts or schools have faced is can really be helped by good research. And it's exciting to hear both quantitative and qualitative research like that, like you're doing. And I guess my question for Rhonda is the HUMRO work by legislation and funding focused specifically within the Office of Assessment and Accountability, or how broadly does it go? So, for example, one thing that often happens is in states, the support functions for accountability are in a different group than the mechanisms for generating the scores and doing the identification. And so a large part of what Art was talking about is checking that the identification is being done well, the calculations. But I think what Elena was saying is, if you're interested in support, then you would want to really look at what is effective supports. And so that's just an example of how closely is HUMRO's work tied to the responsibilities of assessment and accountability, and in Rhonda, your office in particular.
Sure, I can speak to that a little bit, Brian. Obviously, HUMRO does the requirement that's in state legislation around the third-party checking, but we do have HUMRO involved in other additional work. For instance, I think right now today they have some alignment work going on for English learners and looking at our standards compared to the WIDA standards. So there is the need to keep that kind of a clear line as a third party checker that is a legal issue. But we do, value HUMRO as a partner. They've been with us for many years, have an office here in Kentucky. And so they are able to do some other things. So it's not that everything in the HUMRO contract is directed by that statutory requirement. But I think you noticed today, Art made a comment where he talked about kind of a separation between Pearson's work and their work. That gets into that third party checking. So, there certainly could be some areas of flexibility, I think. And I'll look to Art, who's been around this work for many years. We were only mere children when we began. And so together. And so, Art, I don't know if your interpretation is similar to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly the way that we interpret it. And Rhonda, we're always very careful not to sort of cross the line where, where we're, where anyone might be able to claim that, we have a vested interest in Pearson's results or anything like that. But, in the past, we have done, lots of work associated with the accountability system and the way that functions. And, some of the earliest work that I did in Kentucky was looking at sort of the claims and interpretation structure around the assessment and accountability system, and whether we could sort of identify whether schools that were doing the things that the Kentucky department indicated were best practice were performing better than the schools that were not, and even correcting for everything that we could think of to correct for. We found that was true. So if the schools were doing more of the things that were recommended, they were performing better and gaining faster. Now that work is very, very old. Like Rhonda said, we started when we were children. So that work is more than 20 years old at this point. But as far as I know, Kentucky is one of the only states that's ever done that. That very rudimentary, very simplistic thing. If you do what the state says, your scores improve faster than if you don't, kind of analysis. So I would love to do more of that kind of work. I think it's really important. And I think it's a thing that gets left out in the world. I think whenever we build those validity arguments and people interpret their results, we don't look to see whether what they do matters enough. So, and I'll get off my soapbox at that point. But yeah, I think it's really important stuff.
Thanks,
And
Art.
yeah, and I started to say, Brian, I don't know if you should call on Phoebe or if I should, since I was chatting. So I may, but
Why don't you go ahead?
Phoebe,
and people are responding to you, Art.
All right.
I'm just getting on the soapbox with you, Art. I think it is so commendable that Kentucky evaluates its programs and evaluates its accountability system. I think I probably say this at each meeting because I'm still so wowed by the idea that there's a validity framework that addresses accountability. It's just something that we don't do, unfortunately, much less the practices and things like that. So I just want to commend Kentucky for doing that. Once again, I'll probably do this every time until I finally get used to the idea that they are actually doing, you guys are actually doing good research on it.
Corinne.
Sorry. This is Corinne Manley from UF. I'm going to join the soapbox too. I have a little bit stuck in my head about where we were starting to go in the weeds about how sometimes our data isn't sensitive to changes in the way that, and statistically, I know exactly what we mean. But I think it's really important that if a state or school or district is trying to target changes in a group, that the system quantifies that change for them in some way, that it's reflected in the system, right? I'm thinking right now about the big changes going on in reading instruction, and the expectation is that they'll see changes. And I think if we end up saying, well, those kind of wash away given your starting status, and I know why those things happen statistically, I think it's really important that we go the opposite way too. We don't just explain the change that we've measured, but we consistently look and say, how do we quantify the changes in the way that they are trying to make them, and capture that for them so that they aren't misled to think, oh, what we're doing isn't making a difference or it's not having an impact. Yeah.
Thanks. Brian, I'll stop trying to take back over, so I'll give it back to you.
Well, it's great to have recognition of the good work that Humro and Kentucky are doing. It's great to have both a mandate to do it and a budget and a strong partner. And I think that part of this you could hear was the TAC members' enthusiasm for it. And my question was, we can work this out on TAC agendas as well as sort of what are the boundaries. We don't want the TAC recommending things that actually Humro couldn't do or doesn't have the permission or a mandate to do. But thank you. So we will end before 3 o'clock Eastern. The last things I have are some just a summary and follow-up parts. I will have the public minutes to a draft of those to the KTAC members in the next couple of days. If you could look for that and then provide any feedback, because the department needs to post their minutes within a week or so. And so I will get those to Kevin O'Hara at the department. The other has to do with our meeting date. We had scheduled a meeting date for October, and for various reasons that we couldn't do that. And that's we left in November, and we couldn't find anything in November or December. So our next meeting, confirmed meeting date that I have is January 17, 18, and I have it as an in-person meeting in Kentucky. The department has suggested that perhaps it would be wiser to make that a virtual meeting because the winter travel might make things difficult for people to do. TAC members, do you have any response to that? If we kept the dates, but and we could have a longer meeting, but we would probably do something more like 5 hours per day, starting a little bit later, so that the West Coast people in the western part of the U.S. time zones wouldn't have to get up before dawn in January. Do we have any objections to that, or people are okay? Corinne's giving us a thumbs up or hands up.
Yeah, I'm fine either way. My only thought is that we make the decision soon enough. You know, I always say as a parent, if I'm going to be traveling out of town, I need to know way ahead of time. But either one is fine. Okay.
I think we're looking to decide today. So we have the dates. The question is, do you approve of having a virtual meeting on those days? And we will send out a poll to get our in-person meeting in plenty of time so people know about it. And because it'll take a day some people take a day to get there and a day to get back, so that you know about that. I think the department would probably like to have another shorter, probably single topic meeting, but before at least one before January. That may be easier for us to schedule than it was to find a two-person one. It was really hard to do that for people. So I'll send a poll to the department and TAC members to try to do that. We don't know quite what the agenda is yet, but I'm sure there'll be timely things for us to do. But the last thing I'd like to do is ask the TAC members, now that you've seen some of the things that we have, and many of the topics were forward looking. If you have specific topics that you would suggest might be useful, especially as we get into a more comprehensive review of the assessment system, which we've been spending a lot of time on accountability. If there are specific topics that you have, then we can start planning those agendas and the meeting, and people can get, the vendors and others can get ready for them. So if you just send a note to me as you have thoughts, that'd be great. Are there any other suggestions that we have? Elena.
I'm, as you probably know, Brian, I'm not exactly the type of person who enjoys a lot of travel, but I just wanted to also, put it out there that there is something to be said about some of the in-person types of interaction and the quality of those interactions. They are quite different, particularly when you're dealing with more technical topics that require a lot more in-depth kind of just I would say processing of information, and it's just the ability to kind of read the body language as well as to be able to understand, to be able to kind of process as well as to talk through the information with people together. It's a different dynamic. And so I only bring this up because I think it does sometimes the virtual environment makes it a little bit more constrained to explore topics in a little bit more depth as much as we'd like. And again, it's not because I'm eager to travel or to go to, I'd love to visit Kentucky one day, of course, but I think it does add value to the quality of the conversation. So I just would like to put it out there as a consideration, because I think, especially if these are 2 full days of I would consider as pretty heavy topics, particularly if we're talking about accountability results and looking at some of the analysis that's been done around that. I think it's going to be really important for us to be able to really walk through that and talk through that in a lot more depth and discussion. If there's any possibility perhaps to consider an in-person meeting because of the weightiness of those topics, I think it might be something worth considering.
Thanks. I agree with you absolutely that in-person makes a really big difference, both when we have complex topics, and also I think the department and I recognize that the TAC hasn't ever met in person. And in Kentucky, I think that'll be an important thing to do, and probably for a couple of times, because I think there are different relationships when you can see it. So I was persuaded in January, because when we were talking about this, there were several, early on, the department was saying that they had light snowfalls, and it created a lot of travel interruptions because Kentucky isn't used to snow, and so they were just saying, maybe for the in-person one, let's maybe choose a better time when we think there'll be better weather. So it's, I think, more of a postponement than not a commitment to do it. Rhonda, go ahead, Phoebe, please.
No, I really empathize with Elena's. I don't know if that's the right word, but empathize. But anyway, I agree with. I really think that being in person is important. But I'm also. I don't want to get stuck. That's it. So I'm torn. If we could just guarantee no flight delays, it would be wonderful.
Well, Kentucky's lucky because they have 2 major airports in Cincinnati and Louisville, and then there are other smaller airports. So when the weather's good, then it's very easy to get good schedules. But when the weather's bad, it tends to disrupt both flights, and the roads get shut down. Thank you again to the KTAC members. Rhonda, is there anything that you would like to say as we just as in closing?
Just our appreciation for your time and very thoughtful discussion today. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And thank you, Brian, for your masterful facilitation as always.
Well, thank you. We appreciate everyone, and we will look forward to your feedback on the minutes and any other additional tech topics. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks. Have a great rest of your day.